Montana Territory, 1873. The winter sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow-covered valley where Samuel Morgan's ranch stood weathered but proud against the harsh Montana wilderness. At 26, Samuel had already lived several lifetimes worth of struggle, his young face bearing the subtle lines of a man who'd fought the elements and won, mostly. He stood at the fence line, squinting at the distant mountains, the leather of his work gloves cracked from years of labor. "Daddy, look what I found." The voice cut through his contemplation, and Samuel turned to see his 5-year-old daughter Emma running toward him, her small boots kicking up snow, dark braids bouncing against her woolen coat. In her mittened hands, she clutched something tightly. "What have you got there, little one?" he asked, kneeling down to her level. Emma opened her hands to reveal a perfect pinecone, its scales intact despite the harsh winter. "It's for Mama's grave. Do you think she'll like it?" Something tightened in Samuel's chest, that familiar ache that never quite went away. "I think she'd love it, Emma. Your mama always did appreciate the small treasures you'd find." As they walked hand in hand toward the small fenced plot on the hill where Catherine Morgan had rested for 3 years now, Samuel felt the weight of his daughter's trust. Emma had been barely 2 when the fever took her mother, leaving Samuel to raise her alone on this unforgiving land. He'd built this ranch from nothing, driven by the dream he and Catherine had shared, but some days the vastness of the territory seemed to mock his solitary struggle. The frontier was no place for half measures, and love was a luxury that Samuel Morgan could no longer afford. His daughter needed stability, not the risk of more heartbreak. The ranch demanded every ounce of his strength and focus. These were the truths he'd come to accept, the armor he'd built around what remained of his heart. As Emma carefully placed the pinecone against her mother's headstone, Samuel's gaze drifted across the valley to the road leading to town. Somewhere out there, people were building lives, making connections, falling in love, but not him. "Never again him. Time to head back, Emma," he said softly. "Got chores to finish before sunset." "Can we have biscuits for supper?" she asked, slipping her small hand back into his. "We can try," Samuel answered with a half-smile, knowing full well his biscuits were hard enough to build a foundation with. He was no cook, just one more failing in his attempt to be both mother and father to this child. The Morgan Ranch was modest by some standards. A sturdy 2-story main house built of local timber, a barn that housed their small herd's needs through winter, and a bunkhouse for the 2 hired hands who helped during busier seasons. It wasn't grand, but it was theirs, built on land Samuel had earned through years of driving cattle for wealthier men until he could afford his own claim. That night, as he tucked Emma into bed, her sleepy voice caught him by surprise. "Daddy, why don't you ever smile like in the picture with Mama?" Samuel glanced at the small framed photograph on Emma's bedside table, himself and Catherine on their wedding day, both impossibly young and radiating joy. He barely recognized that version of himself anymore. "I smile plenty," he deflected, pulling the quilt up to her chin. "Not the same way," Emma persisted, yawning. "Mrs. Patterson says you need a wife." Samuel stiffened. Helen Patterson, the town busybody who ran the general store, had apparently been filling his daughter's head with nonsense again. "Mrs. Patterson should mind her own business," he said more sharply than intended, then softened his tone. "The ranch keeps me plenty busy, Emma. We're doing just fine, you and me." But later, sitting alone by the dying fire, a letter from the bank spread before him, Samuel faced harder truths. The drought last summer had hit their herd hard. The roof needed repairs before spring. The mortgage payment was overdue again. He was barely keeping his head above water, and the weight of it all pressed down upon him like the mountains themselves. The frontier wasn't just hard on hearts, it was merciless to those who tried to tame it alone. 2 weeks later, the first real break in the winter weather brought Samuel to town for supplies. Emma sat beside him on the wagon bench, bundled against the cold but excited for the rare trip. "Can we get candy, Daddy?" she asked as the buildings of Riversbend came into view, the small town nestled in the valley like a handful of wooden blocks tossed alongside the river. "We'll see," Samuel said, which was his way of saying no without disappointing her immediately. Candy was an extravagance they couldn't afford, but Emma's face lit up with hope anyway. They passed the Silver Dollar Saloon, its weathered sign creaking in the wind, and the jail where Sheriff Adams tipped his hat as they rode by. Riversbend wasn't much compared to bigger settlements like Helena, but it served as the lifeblood for the surrounding ranches and farms, a place to trade goods, hear news, and occasionally remember what civilization felt like. Samuel pulled the wagon to a stop in front of Patterson's general store, helping Emma down before securing the horses. "Remember to mind your manners," he reminded her, though he hardly needed to. For all his failings as a parent, Emma had somehow grown into a polite, thoughtful child. The bell above the door jingled as they entered the store, the familiar sense of coffee, leather, and dried goods enveloping them. Helen Patterson stood behind the counter, her gray hair pulled into a severe bun, spectacles perched on her nose as she tallied numbers in her ledger. "Samuel Morgan, as I live and breathe," she said, looking up. "And little Miss Emma. My, how you've grown since Christmas." "Hello, Mrs. Patterson," Emma replied with a small curtsy that made the older woman beam. Samuel nodded politely. "Mrs. Patterson, need to pick up my usual order and see about some roof nails." "Of course," she gestured toward the back. "And I've set aside that book I mentioned for Emma. Educational reading, just as you requested." As Samuel moved through the store gathering his supplies, the bell above the door jingled again. He paid it little mind until he heard a voice that stopped him in his tracks, a woman's voice, musical and clear, with an accent he couldn't quite place. "Excuse me, but might you direct me to whoever handles the post in this town?" Samuel turned, a sack of flour in his arms, and found himself looking at a young woman unlike any he'd seen in Riversbend before. She stood near the entrance, removing leather gloves from delicate hands, her traveling coat dusted with the light snow that had begun to fall outside. Her hair was the color of summer wheat, swept up beneath a modest hat that nonetheless couldn't hide its abundance. Her eyes, when they briefly met his, were a startling shade of blue, not the pale sky of summer but the deeper hue of twilight. "That would be me, dear," Mrs. Patterson answered, moving toward the stranger. "I handle the mail that comes through on the stage. Helen Patterson, at your service." "Abigail Fletcher," the young woman replied, extending her hand. "I've come from Boston to take the teaching position. I was told to inquire about lodging arrangements upon arrival." Samuel nearly dropped the flour. The teaching position had been vacant for months since old Mr. Hargrove had retired. The town council had sent letters east, but most had assumed no one would answer the call, certainly not someone like this woman who looked as though she belonged in a drawing room rather than a frontier schoolhouse. "Mrs. Patterson's face lit up with delight. "Miss Fletcher, we'd nearly given up hope. The stage wasn't expected until next week." "I came ahead on the mail coach," Abigail explained. "I was eager to arrive and establish myself before the school term begins." Samuel couldn't help noticing the slight hesitation in her words, the way her gloved fingers twisted together despite her composed expression. There was a story there, he thought, before reminding himself it was none of his concern. "Daddy," Emma tugged at his coat, "is she going to be my teacher?" His daughter's voice drew Abigail's attention, and her serious expression softened into a genuine smile as she spotted the little girl. "Hello there," she said, bending slightly to Emma's level. "And who might you be?" "I'm Emma Morgan," his daughter announced proudly. "I'm 5 3/4, and I already know my letters and numbers up to 20. "Well, Emma Morgan," Abigail replied with a gravity that respected the child's pride, "that is most impressive. I believe we shall get along splendidly." Samuel felt oddly tongue-tied as those twilight blue eyes rose to meet his again. He managed a stiff nod. "Samuel Morgan, my daughter will be in your class." "Mr. Morgan owns one of the better cattle operations in the valley," Mrs. Patterson interjected, her matchmaking intentions transparent. "A widower these past 3 years." Samuel shot the shopkeeper a warning look, which she blithely ignored. "A pleasure, Mr. Morgan," Abigail said, apparently untroubled by Mrs. Patterson's impropriety. "I look forward to teaching Emma." Before Samuel could formulate a proper response, Sheriff Adams burst through the door, bringing a gust of cold air and tension with him. "Trouble brewing, folks," he announced grimly. "Just got word the Blackwater gang was spotted 30 miles south. They hit the stagecoach yesterday, 2 passengers dead." The atmosphere in the store changed instantly. Samuel instinctively moved closer to Emma, while Mrs. Patterson gasped and pressed a hand to her chest. "The Blackwater gang." Abigail repeated, her complexion suddenly ashen. "Here." Sheriff Adams seemed to notice her for the first time. "Ma'am, you must be our new schoolteacher. Awful timing, I'm afraid. These outlaws have been terrorizing settlements across 3 territories. Best everyone stays alert and keeps to town for a few days." Samuel frowned. He couldn't stay in town. The ranch needed tending, animals needed feeding. He glanced down at Emma, torn between keeping her safe and his responsibilities. "Miss Fletcher will need lodging," Mrs. Patterson said into the tense silence. "The schoolhouse isn't properly prepared yet." Before Samuel could process what was happening, Emma spoke up. "She could stay with us, couldn't she, Daddy? We have the extra room where Aunt Martha sleeps when she visits." 4 pairs of eyes turned to Samuel, who found himself cornered by his daughter's innocent suggestion, Mrs. Patterson's calculating smile, the sheriff's distracted nod of approval, and most disconcertingly Abigail Fletcher's wide, uncertain gaze. "I couldn't possibly impose," Abigail began. "It's settled then, Mrs. Patterson declared before Samuel could object. "Miss Fletcher will stay at the Morgan Ranch until the schoolhouse is ready and this outlaw business is resolved. Samuel's place is one of the most secure in the valley, with those 2 ranch hands of his." And just like that, Samuel Morgan, who had sworn off complications, attachments, and anything resembling vulnerability, found himself offering his home to a complete stranger with twilight eyes and a mysterious past. "We should leave soon if we're going to beat the weather," he said gruffly, surrendering to circumstances beyond his control. "Storms coming in from the north." As they loaded supplies into the wagon 20 minutes later, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that the approaching storm was the least of his worries. Abigail Fletcher sat primly on the bench beside Emma, who chattered excitedly about the ranch, seemingly oblivious to the tension in her father's shoulders. "I apologize for the imposition, Mr. Morgan," Abigail said quietly when Emma paused for breath. "I assure you I'll find other arrangements as soon as possible." Samuel glanced at her, noting the determined set of her chin despite the uncertainty in her eyes. There was something more to her hasty arrival than simply ambition for a teaching position, but he knew better than most that everyone deserved their secrets. "It's no trouble," he lied, flicking the reins to set the horses in motion. "But you should know what you're getting into. The ranch is isolated, the work never-ending, and the comforts few compared to Boston." Abigail gazed ahead at the vast landscape, the mountains looming in the distance. "I didn't come west expecting comforts, Mr. Morgan. I came seeking possibility." There was a weight to her words that resonated uncomfortably within him, a recognition of something shared despite their obvious differences. Samuel focused on the road ahead, telling himself the flutter of unease he felt was merely concern about the approaching storm, not the woman beside him who carried her own kind of weather with her. The snow began to fall more heavily as they left town behind, the future as uncertain as the path ahead, gradually disappearing beneath winter's white blanket. The journey to the Morgan Ranch took over an hour through increasingly heavy snowfall. Abigail sat with Emma tucked against her side beneath the wagon's buffalo robe, the child's excited commentary eventually fading into sleepy silence as the gentle rocking motion lulled her toward slumber. Samuel drove with the focused attention of a man who knew every rut and turn in the road, even as snow obscured the familiar landmarks. Occasionally he would glance sideways, his gaze meeting Abigail's briefly before returning to the path ahead. In those fleeting moments she sensed his assessment, his wariness, and something else she couldn't quite name. "The storm's coming in faster than I expected," he finally said, breaking the long silence between them. "We'll need to get you and Emma settled quickly when we arrive. My hands, Joe and Thomas, will see to the horses and wagon." "I'm not afraid of work, Mr. Morgan," Abigail replied, straightening her shoulders beneath her heavy coat. "I may be from Boston, but I'm not made of porcelain." A ghost of a smile touched his lips before disappearing. "Never suggested you were, Miss Fletcher. But this cold can turn dangerous fast for those not accustomed to it." Abigail nodded, acknowledging the truth in his words. The Montana winter was unlike anything she had experienced in Massachusetts, rawer somehow, more immediate in its threat. "There it is," Samuel said as they crested a small rise. "Morgan Ranch." Through the curtain of falling snow, Abigail made out the shapes of several buildings nestled in a protected valley. The main house was larger than she had expected, 2 full stories with a covered porch and smoke curling from the stone chimney. Behind it stood a substantial barn and what appeared to be a bunkhouse. The entire property was surrounded by split-rail fencing, creating a boundary between civilization and the wilderness beyond. As they approached, two men emerged from the barn, raising their hands in greeting before moving to help with the team and wagon. "Joe Thomas," Samuel acknowledged with a nod as he pulled the wagon to a halt. "This is Miss Fletcher, the new schoolteacher. She'll be staying with us until the schoolhouse is ready." The men touched their hats respectfully, though Abigail didn't miss the surprised look they exchanged. Clearly, Samuel Morgan bringing home a young woman was an unexpected development. "Joe, once the horses are settled, bring Miss Fletcher's trunk to the house. Thomas, check the north pasture fence before the snow gets too deep. I'm worried about that section we repaired last week." With practiced efficiency, Samuel lifted the still drowsy Emma into his arms, then extended his free hand to help Abigail down from the wagon. Even through their gloves, she felt the strength in his grip, steady, reliable, and gone too quickly as he released her the moment her boots touched the ground. "This way," he said, turning toward the house with Emma's head resting on his shoulder. Abigail followed, her trunk temporarily forgotten as she took in her surroundings. Despite the gathering storm, or perhaps because of it, there was a stark beauty to the landscape that caught her breath, the mountains rising in the distance, the pine forest encroaching from the east, the open pasture land now blanketed in pristine white. The porch steps creaked beneath their weight as Samuel pushed open the front door and ushered her inside. Warmth enveloped them immediately, and Abigail realized someone had kept the fire burning during their absence. The interior was simpler than the exterior had suggested. A large main room with a stone fireplace, sturdy furniture that spoke more of function than fashion, and touches of home that could only have been a woman's influence from years past. "I'll put Emma down for a nap," Samuel said, already moving toward the stairs. "Make yourself comfortable. There's coffee on the stove if you want to warm up." Left alone, Abigail removed her hat and gloves, then her heavy traveling coat, hanging them carefully on hooks near the door. Her fingers, stiff from the cold, fumbled slightly with the buttons, and she found herself fighting an unexpected wave of uncertainty. What had she done, coming to this remote place? Fleeing Boston had seemed the only option after. No, she wouldn't think about that now. This was her chance for a fresh start, to build something meaningful far from the shadows of her past. The main room revealed more about Samuel Morgan than he probably realized. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled not just with practical manuals on ranching and animal husbandry, but literature as well, Dickens, Twain, even Shakespeare. A rocking chair near the fire held a small cushion embroidered with wildflowers, clearly a woman's work. And on the mantel stood several framed photographs. Samuel with a beautiful dark-haired woman, the same woman holding an infant Emma, and a larger family grouping that must have included his parents and siblings. The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced his return. Abigail moved away from the mantel, not wanting to be caught examining his personal mementos. "Emma's asleep," he said, pausing at the bottom of the staircase. "The journey tired her out." "She's a delightful child," Abigail offered sincerely. "You must be very proud." Something softened in his expression. "She's the best of her mother, smart as a whip too. Been teaching her reading myself, but she deserves better instruction than I can give." "You seem to be doing an excellent job," Abigail said. "Not every 5-year-old knows their letters so well." Samuel moved toward the kitchen, his discomfort with the compliment evident in the set of his shoulders. "Let me show you where everything is. You'll be staying in the guest room upstairs next to Emma's." He gave her a brief tour of the house. The kitchen with its iron stove and well-stocked pantry, the small study off the main room, the washroom with its pump and tin bath. Throughout, Abigail noted signs of a household managed by a man alone. The practical organization, the absence of decorative touches, the mended furniture that spoke of utility over beauty. Yet there were also the more subtle indications of a father devoted to his daughter, carefully preserved drawings tacked to the wall, a child-sized chair pulled up to the dining table, a collection of pine cones and interesting stones displayed on a windowsill. "It's not what you're used to," Samuel said as they climbed the stairs to the second floor, "but it's clean and warm." "Mr. Morgan," Abigail said, pausing on the landing, "I hope you won't continue to assume you know what I'm used to. My circumstances in Boston were—" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Let's just say I came west seeking simplicity, not luxury." Samuel studied her for a moment, his hazel eyes thoughtful beneath his furrowed brow. At 26, his face carried both youth and experience, the weathered look of a man who worked outdoors, combined with features that might have been considered handsome in more relaxed moments. "Fair enough, Miss Fletcher," he finally said. "We all have our reasons for being where we are." He showed her to a modest but comfortable bedroom with a patchwork quilt on the bed, a small dresser, and a window overlooking the valley. "My sister Martha stays here when she visits from Helena. There should be enough room for your things." A knock at the front door interrupted them. "That'll be Joe with your trunk," Samuel said, already moving toward the stairs. Left alone, Abigail crossed to the window, watching the snow continue to fall, transforming the landscape into something otherworldly. In the distance, beyond the fence line, a small herd of deer emerged from the tree line, moving cautiously through the deepening snow. This place was as foreign to her as another country, yet something about its wild beauty and stark honesty called to something deep within her, a longing for authenticity she hadn't even realized she carried until this moment. When Samuel returned with her trunk, he set it down just inside the door. "We usually eat supper around 6, he said, already backing toward the hallway. "I'll leave you to get settled." "Mr. Morgan," Abigail called as he turned to go. When he paused, she continued, "Thank you for your hospitality. I know this arrangement wasn't your idea, and I'm grateful for your accommodation." He nodded once, something unreadable passing across his features. "Rest if you need to. The storm's setting in for the duration, from the look of it. We might be snowed in for a day or two." After he left, Abigail sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers tracing the careful stitching of the quilt. Snowed in on a remote ranch with a taciturn widower, and his precocious daughter was hardly what she'd envisioned when she'd boarded the train in Boston 3 weeks ago. Yet as she listened to the howl of the wind outside and the creaking of this house that had weathered many such storms, she felt strangely at peace for the first time in months. Whatever the future held in this wild territory, at least for the moment, she was safe. By evening, the storm had developed into a full blizzard, the wind screaming around the corners of the house, rattling windows and finding every crack and crevice. Samuel added extra logs to the fire, grateful for the substantial woodpile he'd insisted on building before winter set in properly. Emma had awakened from her nap full of energy and questions about their guest, most of which Samuel deflected as he prepared a simple supper. He was no great cook, another skill he'd been forced to develop after Catherine's death, but he could manage a decent stew and cornbread, which seemed appropriate given the weather. "Can Miss Fletcher tell me a bedtime story tonight?" Emma asked, setting forks on the table with careful precision. "Mrs. Patterson says people from Boston know different stories than we do out here." "You'll have to ask her yourself," Samuel replied, checking the cornbread in the oven. "And remember, she's our guest, not your personal storyteller." Emma considered this seriously. "But she's going to be my teacher. Teachers tell stories, don't they?" Before Samuel could respond, Abigail appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had changed from her traveling clothes into a simpler dress of deep green wool, her golden hair now loosely braided and draped over one shoulder. The transformation struck him momentarily speechless. This version of her seemed both more approachable and somehow more elemental, as though the formal city woman had been a disguise she'd shed. "Teachers do indeed tell stories," she said, answering Emma's question with a warm smile. "It's one of the best parts of teaching, I think." Emma beamed. "Would you tell me one tonight, please?" "Daddy tries, but he always forgets the good parts." Samuel felt heat rise in his face at his daughter's frank assessment of his storytelling abilities. "Emma, that's enough. Miss Fletcher is probably tired from her journey." "Not at all," Abigail countered, moving further into the kitchen. "I would be delighted to tell you a story, Emma, and perhaps you could tell me one in return. I'd love to learn what tales are popular here in Montana." The genuine interest in her voice surprised Samuel. Most educated Easterners he'd encountered viewed Western territories as cultural wastelands, the people as rough and unrefined as the landscape. Yet Abigail Fletcher spoke to his daughter as one might address an equal, with respect and curiosity rather than condescension. "Can I help with anything, Mr. Morgan?" she asked, turning those twilight eyes toward him. "Nearly done," he managed, turning back to the stove to hide his discomfort. Having a woman in his kitchen again, especially one so different from Catherine, left him feeling oddly disoriented, as though the familiar space had somehow rearranged itself when he wasn't looking. Supper was a strangely domestic affair. Emma chattered happily, peppering Abigail with questions about Boston, school, and whether she knew how to ride a horse. Not well, Abigail admitted with a laugh, but I'm eager to learn properly. Samuel found himself speaking more than usual, drawn into conversation by Abigail's thoughtful questions about ranching and the local community. "How long has your family been in Montana?" she asked as they finished the meal. Samuel wiped his mouth with a napkin, considering. "My father came out in '49, chasing gold like everyone else, met my mother in a mining camp where she was cooking for prospectors. They gave up on getting rich quick and started ranching instead, smarter investment in the long run. I was born here in '47, never lived anywhere else." "And you've always wanted to be a rancher?" The question was innocent enough, but it probed at old wounds. Samuel's gaze drifted to the bookshelves visible through the kitchen doorway. "Had notions about studying law once before my father died. The ranch needed someone to run it, so here I am." "Daddy knows everything about cows," Emma interjected proudly. "And horses, too. He's teaching me to ride my own pony named Buttercup." Abigail smiled at the child's loyalty. "That's wonderful, Emma, and it sounds like your father is an excellent teacher." "I'm adequate," Samuel corrected, uncomfortable with praise he didn't feel he deserved. "Emma's a natural with animals, makes it easy." After supper, as Samuel washed the dishes, waving away Abigail's offers to help, he listened to the sounds of his daughter and the schoolteacher in the main room. Abigail had discovered Emma's small collection of books and was exclaiming over them with genuine enthusiasm. Their voices blended together, punctuated by Emma's delighted laughter, creating a harmony that made the house feel warmer than the fireplace alone could account for. It had been so long since these rooms had held female voices. Martha visited when she could, but his sister had her own family in Helena, her own responsibilities. Since Catherine's death, the ranch had been a male domain, himself, Emma, and the ranch hands, functional but lacking something essential that he'd forced himself to stop missing. Now, listening to Emma's animated explanations of her favorite stories, Samuel felt an unexpected ache beneath his ribs. His daughter needed this, a woman's influence, someone who understood things he never could. The realization brought both relief and resentment. Relief that Emma might find something she'd been missing, and resentment that he hadn't been enough on his own, despite his best efforts. When he joined them later, Emma was sitting beside Abigail on the sofa, showing her a book of illustrated fairy tales that had belonged to Catherine as a child. "This one's my favorite," Emma was saying, pointing to a colorful picture of a girl in a red cloak. "But the wolf is scary. Daddy says real wolves aren't as tricky, though. They're just hungry sometimes." "Your father is right," Abigail agreed, looking up as Samuel entered. "Most creatures aren't evil, they're just trying to survive, same as people." There was something in her expression as she said this, a shadow of experience that hinted at deeper understanding than mere philosophical musing. Samuel found himself wondering again what had driven this educated young woman to accept a teaching position in a frontier territory, far from the comforts and culture of Boston. "Time for bed, little one," he said, pushing the questions aside. "You can continue showing Miss Fletcher your books tomorrow." "But she promised me a story," Emma protested, though a yawn undermined her argument. "One short story," Samuel conceded, "then straight to sleep." As Abigail followed Emma upstairs, Samuel built up the fire one last time for the night, listening to the storm's continued assault on the house. The blizzard showed no signs of abating. They would likely remain snowbound for at least another day. The thought of spending so much time in close quarters with Abigail Fletcher left him unaccountably nervous. When she returned downstairs 30 minutes later, her expression was soft with amusement. "She fell asleep halfway through the story," Abigail said, settling into the chair opposite his. "I'm not sure whether to be offended or flattered." "Flattered," Samuel assured her. "Usually she fights sleep like it's her sworn enemy." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the howling wind. Samuel found himself studying her profile as she gazed into the flames. The straight nose, the curve of her cheek, the wisps of golden hair that had escaped her braid. At 22, Abigail Fletcher possessed a composure that seemed at odds with her youth, a self-contained quality that suggested experience beyond her years. "May I ask you something, Mr. Morgan?" she said suddenly, turning to face him. Samuel nodded, bracing himself for personal questions he had no intention of answering. Why does Emma not attend school already? Most children begin earlier, even in rural areas. The question surprised him. The previous teacher, Mr. Hargrove, was in his 70s and set in his ways. Didn't believe girls needed much education beyond basic reading and household management. I disagreed. He shrugged, uncomfortable with how revealing the answer felt. Decided I'd rather teach her myself until a more progressive teacher was found. Abigail's expression brightened with understanding. You wanted her to have real education, not just training for domesticity. My wife was well-read, Samuel said quietly. Loved poetry, history, always said knowledge was the true frontier, bigger than any territory. Wanted that for Emma. He rarely spoke of Catherine, especially to strangers, and the words felt foreign on his tongue. Yet something about Abigail's genuine interest made the memories less painful to revisit. She sounds like a remarkable woman, Abigail said. She was. The simple truth of those two words hung in the air between them. After another moment of silence, Abigail asked, "And what about you, Mr. Morgan? Do you also believe knowledge is the true frontier?" Samuel considered the question seriously. "I believe it's a tool like any other. Helps you build something worthwhile if you've got the right materials to work with." "And what are you building here?" Her gaze was direct, uncompromising in its curiosity. "A future for Emma," he answered without hesitation. "A place that'll still be standing when she's grown, something she can choose to keep or leave as she sees fit." Abigail nodded slowly. A worthy project. Children deserve such foundations. There was a wistfulness in her tone that caught his attention. "And you, Miss Fletcher, what brings a Boston-educated woman to teach in a frontier town barely on the map?" Her eyes returned to the fire, her expression closing like a book. Opportunity, adventure. The chance to make a difference in a place where education matters. The words were perfectly reasonable, even admirable, but Samuel recognized the deflection for what it was. Everyone had their secrets, their private pains. He of all people had no right to pry. "Well," he said, rising from his chair, "we're fortunate to have you, regardless of your reasons. Emma already seems taken with you." Abigail looked up, a genuine smile softening her features. "She's a special child. You've done well with her, Mr. Morgan, despite the difficulties you must have faced." The compliment, delivered with such sincerity, left Samuel momentarily without words. He was unaccustomed to praise, particularly regarding his parenting, which he constantly feared was inadequate. "I should check the fire in the kitchen stove before turning in," he said finally, retreating to more comfortable ground. "The house gets cold quickly when the temperature drops this low." "Of course," Abigail stood as well, smoothing her skirt. "Thank you again for your hospitality. I know this arrangement was unexpected." In the soft firelight, with her hair glowing gold and her eyes reflecting the flames, she looked like something from another world, too refined, too luminous for the rough-hewn reality of ranch life. Yet there was also a resilience to her that suggested she might belong in this harsh territory more than her appearance would suggest. "Good night, Mr. Morgan," she said, moving toward the stairs. "Samuel," he found himself saying. When she turned, surprise evident in her expression, he added awkwardly, "You can call me Samuel. Mr. Morgan makes me feel like my father." The smile she gave him then was different from any he'd seen from her before, smaller, more personal, as though they'd just exchanged a confidence rather than a mere formality. "Good night, Samuel," she amended, "and in that case please call me Abigail." Long after she had gone upstairs, Samuel remained by the fire, listening to the storm and trying to ignore the unsettling awareness that something fundamental had shifted in his carefully ordered existence. He had constructed his life since Catherine's death as a fortress against vulnerability, his responsibilities to Emma and the ranch forming walls against the possibility of further loss. Now, watching the flames consume the logs he'd split himself, Samuel couldn't escape the suspicion that Abigail Fletcher might represent a threat to those defenses. Not through any deliberate action on her part, but simply through her presence, which had already brought both his daughter and his home to life in ways he'd forgotten were possible. Outside, the blizzard raged on, nature's reminder that some forces couldn't be controlled or predicted, only endured. Samuel added another log to the fire and tried not to think about the woman sleeping upstairs, or the changes her arrival might herald in a life he'd convinced himself was complete exactly as it was. The blizzard lasted 3 days, transforming the ranch into an isolated island in a sea of white. Snowdrifts piled against the buildings, reaching halfway up the windows in some places, while the wind sculpted fantastic shapes across the open pasture land. Samuel and his ranch hands spent hours each day clearing paths between the house, barn, and bunkhouse, ensuring the livestock remained fed and watered despite the extreme conditions. Inside the house, an unexpected harmony developed. Abigail revealed herself to be both capable and adaptable, willingly sharing in household tasks without being asked. She baked bread that put Samuel's attempts to shame, mended a tear in Emma's winter coat with invisible stitches, and spent hours at the kitchen table working with the child on reading and simple mathematics. On the afternoon of the third day, as the storm finally began to abate, Samuel returned from the barn to find Abigail and Emma sitting cross-legged on the floor before the fireplace, surrounded by paper shapes. "What's all this?" he asked, stomping snow from his boots at the door. "Origami," Abigail explained, looking up with bright eyes. "Paper folding from Japan. My father had business associates from the Orient who taught me when I was about Emma's age." "Look, Daddy," Emma held up a delicate paper crane. "I made this one myself. Miss Abigail says in Japan, they believe if you make 1,000 paper cranes, your wish will come true." "That's quite something," Samuel said, genuinely impressed by the intricate creation in his daughter's small hands. "What would you wish for?" Emma's expression turned solemn as she considered the question. "I can't tell you or it won't come true. That's how wishes work." Samuel smiled despite himself. "Is that so? Well, then I won't pry into such important business." His gaze met Abigail's over Emma's head, and something passed between them. A shared appreciation of the child's seriousness, perhaps, or simply the comfortable domesticity of the moment. Whatever it was, it left Samuel feeling both warmer and more unsettled than the fire's heat could explain. "Storm's breaking up," he said, forcing his attention back to practical matters. "Roads should be passable by tomorrow afternoon, if no more snow falls overnight." "Does that mean Miss Abigail has to leave?" Emma asked, distress evident in her voice. "Eventually," Samuel hedged, uncertain how to navigate his daughter's growing attachment to their guest. "But not right away. Miss Abigail needs to get settled at the schoolhouse, and that will take some time." "I was actually hoping to visit the schoolhouse tomorrow, if the weather permits," Abigail said. "I'd like to see what supplies are available and what might be needed before classes begin." "I can take you," Samuel offered before he could think better of it. "Need to go to town anyway to check mail and see about a part for the plow." "Can I come too, Daddy?" Emma immediately asked. "I want to see my new school." "Don't you think you've been cooped up with adults enough these past few days?" Samuel countered gently. "Mrs. Harris from the next ranch over has been asking when you might visit to play with her granddaughter Lily. Thought you might like to spend the day there while I take Miss Abigail to town." Emma's face lit up at the mention of her friend. "Can we bring Lily some of the paper birds to show her?" "I think that would be lovely," Abigail agreed. "Perhaps you could teach her how to make them." With Emma's concerns addressed, the evening passed pleasantly. After supper, they gathered in the main room where Abigail read aloud from one of the books on Samuel's shelves, Dickens, A Christmas Carol, which Emma had never heard before. Her animated reading brought the story to life, complete with different voices for each character that had Emma giggling and even drew reluctant smiles from Samuel. Later, after Emma had gone to bed, Samuel found himself once again alone with Abigail by the fire. These evening conversations had become a ritual during the storm days, a quiet time when they spoke of books, ranching, teaching, safe topics that nevertheless revealed more about each other than either might have intended. "You have a wonderful library for such a remote location," Abigail commented, running her fingers along the spine of the Dickens volume. "Were these your parents' books?" "Some," Samuel acknowledged. "Others were Catherine's, my wife's. She ordered them from catalogs, had them shipped all the way from Chicago or even New York sometimes." He paused, remembering. Reading was her escape when the isolation got too heavy. Said books were like having visitors who never overstayed their welcome. Abigail smiled at the description. "A woman after my own heart. I packed almost as many books as clothes for my journey west. My trunk is half filled with volumes I couldn't bear to leave behind. What kind of books? Samuel asked, genuinely curious. Poetry, Whitman Dickinson, novels by Austen and the Brontes. History, especially of the American Revolution. My grandfather fought at Bunker Hill. She looked slightly embarrassed by her enthusiasm, and practical texts on education, of course. I take my new position very seriously. The town's lucky to have you, Samuel said, meaning it. Most qualified teachers wouldn't consider a place like Riversbend. A shadow crossed her face. Perhaps Riversbend is lucky to have me, but I assure you, I am equally fortunate to have found this position. There it was again, that hint of something left unspoken, a story carefully avoided. Samuel had noticed it several times during their conversations, moments when Abigail seemed to catch herself revealing too much about her reasons for coming west. Boston's loss is our gain, then, he said simply, allowing her the privacy of her secrets. Abigail looked grateful for his discretion. Tell me about your ranch, she said, changing the subject. Emma mentioned it's been in your family for generations. 2 generations, Samuel corrected. My father established it after giving up on striking gold, started small, just a few cattle in this house, which was half the size back then. Added on as the herd grew. And now, how large is your operation? Samuel hesitated, unaccustomed to discussing the ranch's financial situation, especially with someone he barely knew. Yet something about Abigail's genuine interest made the usual barriers seem unnecessary. We run about 300 head these days, he admitted. Used to be more before the drought 2 summers ago. Lost nearly a quarter of the herd then, and rebuilding's been slow. He didn't mention the bank loan that still hung over his head, or the sleepless nights spent calculating whether he could make the next payment. That sounds substantial nonetheless, Abigail observed. You must be proud of what you've built. Maintained more than built, Samuel corrected. Just trying to preserve what my father started, maybe improve it some for Emma's sake. He stared into the fire, adding quietly, not always sure I'm succeeding. The admission cost him something. Samuel rarely voiced his doubts, especially to outsiders, but the past few days had created an unexpected ease between them that lowered his usual defenses. From what I've seen, you're succeeding admirably, Abigail said with a conviction that surprised him. Your ranch is well managed, your daughter is thriving, and you've maintained a home that anyone would be proud of, all on your own, under circumstances that would defeat many. Samuel looked up, startled by the passionate defense she offered of his efforts. In the firelight, her expression was earnest, almost fierce in its certainty. You've known me 3 days, Miss Fletcher, he said, falling back on formality to mask his discomfort with her praise. Hardly time to make such assessments. Abigail, she corrected gently. And sometimes an outsider's perspective sees more clearly precisely because it isn't clouded by years of doubt and self-criticism. Her insight struck too close to home, making Samuel shift uncomfortably in his chair. He was saved from having to respond by a loud crack from outside, a tree branch breaking under the weight of accumulated snow. The sudden noise made them both jump, then laugh at their own startled reactions. I should check that it hasn't fallen on anything important, Samuel said, grateful for the interruption. And it's getting late. Of course, Abigail rose gracefully from her chair. I should retire as well. Tomorrow will be a busy day if we're to visit town. As they both prepared to leave the warmth of the fire, Samuel found himself reluctant to end their conversation despite his discomfort moments earlier. These evening talks had become something he looked forward to, a reminder of simpler times when conversation with an equal had been part of his daily life, not an exceptional occurrence. Abigail, he said as she reached the bottom of the stairs. When she turned, eyebrows raised in question, he continued awkwardly, Thank you for your help with Emma these past days. And for, he gestured vaguely, unable to articulate exactly what he was grateful for beyond her practical assistance. Her smile held understanding beyond his fumbled words. You're welcome, Samuel, for all of it. Long after she had gone upstairs, Samuel stood on the porch, surveying his snow-covered ranch by the light of a moon that had finally emerged from behind the storm clouds. The fallen branch lay harmlessly in the yard, far from any buildings or fences. He could have gone back inside immediately, but the crisp, cold air helped clear his head. In just 3 days, Abigail Fletcher had disrupted the careful equilibrium of his existence, not through any deliberate action, but simply by bringing a different energy into his home. Emma was happier and more animated than he'd seen her in months. The house itself seemed warmer somehow, more alive. And Samuel found himself remembering what it felt like to be seen as more than just a rancher, a widower, a father, to be recognized as a man with thoughts and feelings worthy of interest and response. The sensation was both welcome and terrifying, a thing he wasn't sure he was ready to experience. Tomorrow they would go to town, and the outside world would intrude on the strange, suspended moment the blizzard had created. Abigail would begin establishing herself as Riversbend's schoolteacher. Her role in the community would be formalized, and the comfortable intimacy of these storm-bound days would inevitably fade. Samuel told himself this was for the best. Attachments were dangerous. They created vulnerabilities, dependencies that the harsh reality of frontier life would eventually exploit. He had learned that lesson too well with Catherine's death to forget it now. Yet as he turned to go back inside, stamping snow from his boots once more, Samuel couldn't quite suppress the treacherous hope that something of these past days might survive the return to normal life. That the light Abigail had brought into his home might continue to shine, even as she established her own place in Riversbend, separate from him and his daughter. It was a foolish thought, born of isolation and the false intimacy created by the storm. By spring, the schoolteacher would likely have found her place among the townspeople, while he remained where he had always been, on his ranch, focused on survival, keeping the walls around his heart intact and impenetrable. With that sobering reminder, Samuel Morgan went back inside to bank the fire for the night, pushing aside thoughts of twilight blue eyes and golden hair illuminated by firelight. Some possibilities were better left unexplored, for everyone's sake. The journey to Riversbend the next day revealed a transformed landscape. The blizzard had left behind a pristine world of white, unmarked except for the occasional tracks of deer or rabbit. The road itself was barely visible, but Samuel navigated confidently, having traveled this path countless times in all conditions. "It's breathtaking," Abigail said, gazing at the snow-draped mountains that dominated the horizon. "I've never seen anything so vast and untamed." Samuel glanced sideways at her, noting how the winter sunlight caught in her hair where it escaped the confines of her bonnet. Most Easterners find it overwhelming. Too much space, not enough civilization. "I find it liberating," she replied thoughtfully. "In Boston, everything feels confined, buildings pressing in, social expectations even more constraining. Out here," she gestured toward the open landscape, "there's room to breathe, to become whoever you choose to be." The sentiment surprised him. Most proper ladies from the East viewed the territories as places of deprivation and hardship, not opportunity. Abigail Fletcher continued to defy his expectations at every turn. After dropping Emma at the Harris Ranch, where she was warmly welcomed by 8-year-old Lily and her grandmother, they continued to town. Riversbend looked particularly picturesque under its blanket of snow, smoke rising from chimneys, the main street already partially cleared by the combined efforts of the townspeople. "The schoolhouse is just beyond the church," Samuel explained as they passed the white-steepled building. "Town council had it built 5 years ago when the settlement started growing. Used-to-be classes were held in the back of the general store before that." The schoolhouse was a simple, one-room building with large windows and a small bell tower. As they approached, Samuel noticed Abigail's posture straighten, her expression turning more serious, transforming before his eyes from his houseguest into Riversbend's new schoolteacher. Inside, the schoolhouse was cold and dusty from disuse. Rows of wooden desks faced a larger teacher's desk at the front of the room. A blackboard covered most of the wall behind it, while a pot-bellied stove stood in the corner, currently cold and empty. "Well," Abigail said, her breath visible in the chilled air, "it has potential." Samuel moved to the stove and began preparing a fire from the wood stacked nearby. Old Hargrove wasn't much for decoration, as you can see. But the structure's sound, and the town council voted funds for new books and supplies when they approved your position. Abigail was already moving through the room, running her fingers along desktops, examining the meager bookshelf and peering into cabinets. "How many students will I have?" 15 or so, ranging from 5 to 16, Samuel answered, coaxing the fire to life. "Attendance gets spotty during planting and harvest times when the older ones are needed at home." That's to be expected, Abigail nodded. And what subjects were covered previously? Samuel's expression turned wry. Reading, writing, arithmetic, the basics, some history heavy on American patriotism, Bible study on Fridays. And for the girls, what was their curriculum? Her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Same as the boys until age 12 or so, Samuel admitted. After that, Hargrove believed young ladies needed different preparation for their futures. Sewing and household management became more prominent. Abigail's mouth set in a determined line. That will be changing. The conviction in her voice made Samuel smile despite himself. I suspected as much when I saw how many books on education you brought with you. The town council might have opinions on the matter. Let them, she replied with unexpected fire. I was hired to educate this community's children, and I intend to do so properly, girls and boys alike. As the fire began to warm the room, Abigail continued her inventory, making notes in a small notebook she produced from her pocket. Samuel found himself admiring her methodical approach and clear vision. Catherine had possessed similar determination, though in different areas. She had applied such focus to making their ranch house a true home, refusing to accept the bare functionality most bachelor ranchers settled for. I'll need additional slates, more advanced text for the older students, proper maps, Abigail murmured, more to herself than to Samuel. And this room needs thorough cleaning before classes begin. Town usually organizes a cleaning day before the school term, Samuel offered. Mothers bring their children to help, make it an event with a picnic after. Abigail looked up, her expression brightening. What a wonderful tradition. When might that be arranged? Speak to Reverend Collins. He usually coordinates such things with Mrs. Patterson's help. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside, the sound of horses approaching at speed, followed by shouts and the slamming of doors. Samuel moved to the window, instinctively positioning himself between Abigail and potential danger. What is it? She asked, concern evident in her voice. Riders coming fast into town, Samuel replied, his eyes narrowing as he observed the newcomers. For men I don't recognize. The strangers dismounted in front of the sheriff's office across the street, their manner urgent. One man, taller than the others and wearing a badge on his coat, entered the building while his companions remained with the horses, their hands never far from their weapons. Marshal, Samuel identified the badge wearer. Federal law. Must be serious business. Abigail had joined him at the window, her shoulder nearly touching his as they watched the scene unfold. Could it be about the Blackwater gang? Sheriff Adams mentioned them when I arrived. Samuel nodded slowly. Likely. They've been causing trouble across 3 territories. Murder, robbery, worse, if they've been spotted nearby again. He didn't finish the thought, but concern furrowed his brow. Outlaw gangs usually avoided isolated ranches, preferring the richer targets of stagecoaches and banks, but their unpredictability made them a threat to everyone in the region. Perhaps we should inquire, Abigail suggested, her practical nature asserting itself despite the tension. If there's danger, we should know of it. Samuel hesitated only briefly before nodding. Stay here while I speak with them. No sense in both of us getting involved. I appreciate your concern, Samuel, but I'm perfectly capable of hearing difficult news directly, Abigail countered, already reaching for her coat. Besides, as the schoolteacher, I have a responsibility to be informed about matters that might affect my students. Her reasonable tone made argument difficult. Samuel conceded with a reluctant nod, and they made their way across the snowy street to the sheriff's office, where a small crowd had already begun to gather. Inside, they found Sheriff Adams deep in conversation with the marshal and Mayor Thompson. The tension in the room was palpable, and all 3 men looked up sharply when Samuel and Abigail entered. Morgan, Sheriff Adams acknowledged with a nod. Miss Fletcher, you've met Mayor Thompson. This here's Marshal Grant from the federal office in Helena. The marshal was a hard-looking man in his 40s, with a scar running along his jawline and eyes that had seen too much frontier violence. He assessed Samuel and Abigail with a quick, professional glance before returning to the matter at hand. As I was saying, the Blackwater gang hit the settlement at Copper Creek 3 days ago during the blizzard. Killed 2 men, wounded several others, and cleaned out the Assier's office. We've been tracking them since, and signs point to them heading this way. A murmur ran through the small crowd that had followed Samuel and Abigail inside. Copper Creek was less than 60 miles south, close enough to raise serious concerns. Any particular reason they'd target Riversbend? Mayor Thompson asked, voicing what everyone was thinking. We're hardly a wealthy settlement. They don't always choose targets that make sense, the marshal replied grimly. Sometimes it's opportunity, sometimes it's personal grudges. Their leader, James Blackwood, has connections to this region from before the war, might be coming back to settle old scores. At the mention of Blackwood's name, Samuel felt Abigail stiffen beside him. Glancing down, he was startled to see that all color had drained from her face, her eyes wide with what could only be described as terror. "Abigail," he murmured, concerned by her sudden pallor. "Are you unwell?" She seemed not to hear him, her gaze fixed on the marshal as he continued outlining his plans to protect the town if the gang approached. It was only when Samuel gently touched her elbow that she startled back to awareness, blinking rapidly as though waking from a nightmare. I need air," she whispered, already turning toward the door. "Excuse me." Before Samuel could respond, she had slipped outside. Torn between following her and learning more about the potential threat to his community, he hesitated just long enough for the marshal to notice his concern. "Something wrong with the lady?" Marshal Grant asked, his keen eyes missing nothing. The schoolhouse was cold, Samuel improvised. Probably just needed some fresh air. He turned to Sheriff Adams. What precautions are being recommended for outlying ranches? As the conversation turned to practical security measures, Samuel's mind remained partially on Abigail's strange reaction. Her fear had seemed too specific, too immediate for someone merely concerned about general outlaw threats. It wasn't until the meeting concluded 15 minutes later that he was able to search for her, finding her eventually on the schoolhouse porch, her composure apparently restored though her complexion remained pale. "Are you all right?" he asked without preamble, studying her face for signs of her earlier distress. "Yes, of course," she answered too quickly, "just felt momentarily faint." The contrast between the cold schoolhouse and the crowded sheriff's office, I suppose. The explanation was reasonable enough, but Samuel didn't believe it for a second. Something about the Blackwater gang, or more specifically, its leader, had triggered genuine fear in Abigail Fletcher. The realization stirred protective instincts he'd thought long buried, along with a host of uncomfortable questions. "Abigail," he began carefully, "if there's something." "Did the marshal provide any useful information?" she interrupted, clearly deflecting. "Will there be patrols or other precautions?" Samuel recognized the deliberate change of subject but decided not to press, at least not here in public. "He's organizing a volunteer patrol system. Wants every ranch and homestead alerted, basic security measures in place. They don't expect the gang to hit Riversbend directly, but better safe than sorry." Abigail nodded, her gloved hands clasping and unclasping nervously despite her controlled expression. "Very sensible. When will you collect Emma? Perhaps we should return to the ranch sooner rather than later." "I need to check mail and pick up a few supplies first," Samuel replied, studying her with growing concern. "Are you sure you're well enough for that? You still look shaken." "I'm perfectly fine," she insisted, squaring her shoulders with visible effort. "As you said, there are preparations to make, and time is of the essence. Let's complete our errands efficiently." Despite her protests, Samuel kept a careful eye on Abigail as they visited the general store, the post office, and the blacksmith. She participated in conversation, made appropriate purchases for the schoolhouse, and even charmed Mrs. Patterson with questions about organizing the school cleaning day. But Samuel noticed how her gaze constantly scanned their surroundings, how she startled at sudden movements or loud noises. It wasn't until they were in the wagon heading toward the Harris Ranch to collect Emma that Samuel broached the subject again, the privacy of the open road providing an opportunity that might not come again. "Abigail," he said quietly, keeping his eyes on the path ahead, "I saw your reaction when the marshal mentioned James Blackwood." Her sharp intake of breath confirmed his suspicion, though she didn't immediately respond. "I'm not asking for explanations you don't wish to give," Samuel continued, choosing his words carefully. "But if you're in some kind of danger, I need to know, for Emma's sake as much as yours." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the creak of the wagon and the steady rhythm of the horses' hooves on the packed snow. When Abigail finally spoke, her voice was so low Samuel had to strain to hear it. "It's not what you think," she said, staring at her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I don't know Blackwood personally. I know of him. His reputation reached even Boston in certain circles." The explanation felt incomplete, evasive in a way that set Samuel's instincts on edge. During their days together at the ranch, he'd come to respect Abigail's intelligence and integrity. Her reluctance to speak plainly now suggested something more complex than simple fear of outlaws. "Abigail," he said, drawing the wagon to a halt on the deserted road, "I respect your privacy, but you're staying in my home near my daughter. If there's anything at all, that might bring danger to that door, I deserve to know." When she finally looked at him, the raw vulnerability in her eyes caught him off guard. The composed, capable woman he'd come to know over the past days seemed suddenly younger, haunted by something he couldn't identify. "I left Boston because I had no choice," she said finally. "My father made poor investments, trusted the wrong people. When he died last year, I discovered he'd left nothing but debts and a tarnished name." She drew a shaky breath. "Among his creditors was a man named Victor Harrington, a banker with significant influence. He offered to forgive my father's debts in exchange for marriage." Samuel's hands tightened on the reins as understanding began to dawn. "I take it this Harrington wasn't someone you wished to marry." A bitter laugh escaped her. "He was 30 years my senior, twice widowed, with a reputation for cruelty to his wives. But he had the power to destroy what remained of my father's legacy and leave me destitute." Her jaw tightened with remembered resolve. "So I sold what I could, paid what debts were possible, and used my teaching credentials to secure a position as far from Boston as possible." "And Blackwood," Samuel prompted gently when she fell silent. "How does he connect to this?" Abigail's gaze dropped again. Harrington was rumored to have business dealings with various unsavory elements, men who operated outside the law but served his financial interests. The name Blackwood was mentioned in that context. Whether it's the same man, I can't be certain, but... She left the implication hanging between them. If Blackwood was indeed connected to Harrington, and if Harrington had taken her flight as a personal insult, there existed a slim but terrifying possibility that the outlaw's presence in the territory was not coincidental. "You think Harrington might have sent Blackwood to find you?" Samuel asked, voicing the fear she seemed reluctant to articulate. "No," Abigail said quickly, too quickly. "That would be unlikely, paranoid even. I'm sure it's merely a strange coincidence that has me unsettled. Harrington may be vindictive, but sending outlaws across the country would be extreme even for him." Samuel wasn't entirely convinced by her dismissal, but he recognized that pushing further would only increase her discomfort. Whatever the full truth might be, Abigail clearly believed she had reason to fear, and that was enough for him to take the potential threat seriously. "Either way," he said, setting the wagon in motion again, "you should know that you're safe at the ranch. Joe and Thomas are both good men in a fight, and I've dealt with my share of troubles over the years." The ghost of a smile touched Abigail's lips. "Are you offering me protection, Samuel Morgan?" "Stating facts," he corrected, though he felt an unfamiliar warmth at her use of his full name. "The ranch is defensible, and outlaws generally prefer easier targets." "I appreciate the reassurance," she said softly, "and I apologize for bringing potential complications to your door. Perhaps I should reconsider my accommodations once the schoolhouse is prepared." "No," Samuel interrupted with unexpected firmness. "The arrangement works well for everyone. Emma benefits from your presence, and the ranch is far safer than the schoolhouse, which sits isolated at the edge of town." He didn't add that the thought of Abigail alone in that vulnerable building, with outlaw threats looming, made something cold and hard form in the pit of his stomach. Such concerns were purely practical, he told himself, nothing to do with the growing warmth he felt in her company or the way her smile had begun to feel like sunlight after a long winter. By the time they collected Emma from the Harris Ranch, where she'd spent a happy day playing with Lily despite the worrying news spreading through the community, Samuel had made a silent resolution. Whatever secrets Abigail Fletcher might still be keeping, whatever danger might be approaching from the south, he would ensure that both she and his daughter remained safe, even if that meant confronting the notorious Blackwater gang himself. As they drove back to the ranch with Emma chattering happily between them, Samuel caught Abigail's gaze over the child's head. The silent understanding that passed between them felt like a pact, one that transcended their brief acquaintance and hinted at possibilities neither was yet ready to acknowledge. The sun was setting by the time they reached the ranch, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. In that moment of crystalline beauty, with his daughter's laughter filling the air and Abigail's quiet presence beside him, Samuel allowed himself to imagine a different future than the lonely one he'd resigned himself to after Catherine's death. One where the walls he'd built around his heart might someday be allowed to crumble, making room for new growth in the fertile soil of second chances. It was a dangerous thought, born of circumstances that wouldn't last. But as he helped both his passengers down from the wagon, his hand lingering perhaps a moment too long around Abigail's, Samuel couldn't quite suppress the hope that had begun to take root despite his best efforts to remain safely numb. The following days established a new routine at the Morgan Ranch. Abigail spent mornings working with Emma on more advanced lessons than Samuel had been able to provide, while afternoons were devoted to preparations for the schoolhouse opening. Samuel drove her to town every other day, using ranch business as justification for the regular trips. Throughout the territory, tension remained high. Marshal Grant and his deputies established patrols between settlements, while local men organized watches in Riversbend itself. The Blackwater gang had seemingly disappeared after the Copper Creek raid, which only increased anxiety about where they might strike next. At the ranch, Samuel took his own precautions. Extra ammunition was distributed, horses kept saddled and ready during daylight hours, and the hands took turns standing watch at night. He instructed Joe and Thomas to escort Abigail and Emma if he himself was unavailable, ensuring they were never left vulnerable. A week after their return from town, Samuel found Abigail on the porch late one evening, wrapped in a shawl against the cold, staring at the star-filled sky with a pensive expression. Emma had long since gone to bed, and the ranch was quiet except for the occasional distant howl of coyotes. "You'll freeze out here," he said, stepping outside to join her. Abigail turned with a small smile. "It's worth the chill. I've never seen stars like this, so many they seem impossible to count." Samuel leaned against the porch railing beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her presence without actually touching. "Catherine used to say the same thing when we first married. City folk aren't used to seeing the sky as it really is." "Your wife sounds like she was a remarkable woman," Abigail said softly. "Emma speaks of her often with such love." "She was," Samuel agreed, the familiar ache of loss present but somehow less sharp than usual. "Stronger than she looked, faced frontier life with more courage than many men I've known." "How did you meet her?" The question was gentle, tentative, as though Abigail wasn't sure it was appropriate to ask but couldn't resist her curiosity. Samuel found, somewhat to his surprise, that he wanted to answer, wanted Abigail to know about Catherine, about the love they had shared, about the life they had built together. "Church social in Helena," he said, smiling at the memory. "I was 20, just taken over the ranch after my father passed. She was 18, visiting from St. Louis with her aunt. Beautiful girl with dark hair and the most determined expression I'd ever seen." He chuckled softly. "Told me right away she thought cattle ranching sounded terribly dull, but was willing to be convinced otherwise." "And you convinced her," Abigail prompted, her eyes soft in the starlight. "Took some doing," Samuel admitted. "Spent 6 months writing letters back and forth after she returned to St. Louis, finally sold enough cattle to afford a trip east to court her properly. Her family thought I was mad asking her to come to Montana territory, but Catherine," he shook his head in remembered wonder, "she never doubted, said the only life worth living was one that tested your limits." "She was right," Abigail murmured. "That's what I've discovered since coming west, that there's something profoundly satisfying about facing challenges you once thought impossible." The understanding in her voice resonated with Samuel's own experience. Most Easterners viewed frontier life as a hardship to be endured, not an opportunity to discover one's true capacity. That Abigail saw it differently marked her as someone exceptional, someone who, like Catherine, possessed an inner strength that belied her refined exterior. "What about you?" he asked, turning the conversation away from memories that still carried pain despite the healing passage of time. "No young man waiting for you back in Boston? Besides the unwanted suitor, I mean." Abigail's laugh held little humor. No. My father's financial and social decline made me an unattractive prospect in Boston society, even before the final collapse of his business. And afterwards, she shrugged. Let's just say that a penniless daughter of a disgraced businessman has few romantic options, which is partly why Harrington's proposal seemed so monstrous. Samuel frowned at the matter-of-fact way she described such callous treatment. Boston's loss, he said simply. The words hung between them, weighted with more meaning than he'd intended. When Abigail turned to look at him fully, the vulnerability in her expression made his heart constrict. Sometimes, she said quietly, what seems like the end of everything can actually be the beginning of something better. I couldn't see that when I was fleeing Boston in disgrace, but now. Now, Samuel prompted when she trailed off, finding himself holding his breath for her answer. Now I find myself grateful for the circumstances that brought me here, she finished, her gaze unwavering despite the confession implicit in her words. Even with the complications and uncertainties. Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been building since the blizzard days, when their isolation had created a foundation of understanding that continued to strengthen despite Samuel's attempts to maintain emotional distance. Before he could formulate a response that wouldn't reveal too much of his own conflicted heart, the sound of approaching horses broke the spell. Both turned toward the noise, instantly alert to potential danger. "Expecting visitors?" Abigail asked, tension evident in her voice. "No," Samuel replied grimly, already moving toward the door. "Get inside and wake Joe. He's sleeping in the main room tonight. Tell him to bring the shotgun from behind the door." Abigail didn't question the instructions, immediately doing as he asked, while Samuel retrieved his rifle from its rack inside. By the time he returned to the porch, the approaching riders were visible in the moonlight, 3 men moving at a steady pace up the road to the ranch house. The door opened behind him and Joe stepped out, shotgun in hand. The young ranch hand, barely 20 but already seasoned by frontier life, took position on the other side of the porch without being told. "Can you make them out?" Joe asked quietly, squinting into the darkness. "Not yet," Samuel answered, his finger resting near but not on the trigger of his rifle. "But they're making no attempt to hide their approach, might be neighbors." As the riders drew closer, Samuel recognized the lead figure with both relief and concern. "It's Sheriff Adams," he identified, with Marshal Grant and one of his deputies. The lawmen reined in their horses at the foot of the porch steps, their expressions grave even in the dim light. "Evening, Morgan," Sheriff Adams greeted. "Sorry to disturb you so late." "Sheriff, Marshal," Samuel nodded to each man in turn, not lowering his rifle entirely. "What brings you out at this hour?" Marshal Grant dismounted, his movements betraying the weariness of a man who had ridden hard for many hours. "Information about the Blackwater gang. May we come inside? It's a matter that requires some privacy." The specific request raised Samuel's suspicions immediately. "Does this concern my ranch directly?" "Not your ranch," the marshal replied carefully. "But it may concern your house guest." Samuel felt his stomach tighten at the confirmation of fears he'd been harboring since Abigail's reaction in town. Behind him, the door opened again, and Abigail herself appeared, her face pale but composed in the moonlight. "I believe the marshal is referring to me," she said with quiet dignity. "Please, gentlemen, come inside where we can speak comfortably." The calm authority in her voice impressed Samuel, even as concern for her deepened. Whatever connection existed between Abigail and the outlaws, it seemed the truth was about to be revealed, for better or worse. Inside, lamps were lit and coffee quickly prepared as everyone assembled in the main room. Emma, thankfully, remained asleep upstairs, undisturbed by the late-night visitors. "I'll get straight to the point, Miss Fletcher," Marshal Grant said once they were all seated, his weathered face grave beneath the brim of his hat, which he'd respectfully removed. "We intercepted a member of the Blackwater gang yesterday, a young fellow who turned informant in exchange for leniency." Abigail's hands tightened around her coffee cup, but her voice remained steady. "I see. And what information did this person provide?" He confirmed that the gang isn't just raiding randomly. They're looking for someone specifically, a young woman from Boston who fled west to escape an arranged marriage. The marshal's keen eyes studied Abigail's reaction. "Sound familiar?" Samuel instinctively moved closer to Abigail on the sofa, his protective instincts fully aroused despite having no claim on her beyond friendship and shared living arrangements. Yes, Abigail admitted after a moment's hesitation. Though I don't understand why James Blackwood would have any interest in my whereabouts. As I told Mr. Morgan, I was merely aware of rumors connecting him to certain Boston businessmen. We never met. Marshal Grant exchanged a significant look with Sheriff Adams before continuing. According to our informant, Blackwood was hired to find you by a banker named Victor Harrington. Apparently, the gentleman took your rejection rather personally and wants you returned to Boston, willingly or otherwise. The confirmation of her worst fears drained what little color remained from Abigail's face, but she didn't collapse or dissolve into hysterics as many might have done. Instead, her spine straightened, a spark of defiance lighting her eyes. Mr. Harrington has no claim on me, she stated firmly. I repaid what debts I legally could before leaving Boston, any agreement beyond that was proposed not accepted. That may be, the marshal acknowledged, but Blackwood isn't concerned with legal niceties. He's been paid to deliver you to Harrington, and by all accounts, he intends to fulfill that contract. Over my dead body, Samuel interjected, the words escaping before he could consider their implications. All eyes turned to him, the marshal's assessing, the sheriff's sympathetic, and Abigail's filled with a complicated mixture of gratitude and dismay. That's precisely what we're trying to avoid, Morgan, Marshal Grant said dryly. Blackwood has killed at least 7 men that we know of, many in circumstances exactly like this, someone standing between him and his target. What are you suggesting, then? Samuel demanded, anger rising at the implied criticism of his ability to protect his household. That I simply hand Miss Fletcher over to these criminals. Of course not, Sheriff Adams interjected, his tone conciliatory. The marshal has a plan if you'd hear him out. Marshal Grant nodded his thanks to the sheriff before continuing. We believe Blackwood and his remaining men will make their move within the next few days. Our informant says they've been scouting the area, including this ranch. He paused, allowing the implications of that surveillance to sink in. We propose setting a trap. Miss Fletcher would return with us to town tonight, where we can better protect her while making it appear she's vulnerable. When Blackwood makes his move, we'll be waiting. The idea of using Abigail as bait made Samuel's blood run cold. Absolutely not, he said flatly. The risk is unacceptable. I appreciate your concern, Mr. Morgan, Marshal Grant replied, his patience clearly wearing thin, but this decision isn't yours to make. Miss Fletcher is a grown woman capable of determining her own actions. And I'm the owner of this property, Samuel countered, responsible for everyone under its roof. You're asking me to allow a member of my household to be placed deliberately in harm's way. Before the argument could escalate further, Abigail placed a restraining hand on Samuel's arm. Samuel, she said softly, using his given name deliberately in front of the others, please let me speak. The gentle pressure of her fingers and the quiet authority in her voice succeeded where the marshal's arguments had failed. Samuel subsided, though the tension remained visible in the set of his jaw. Marshal Grant, Abigail addressed the lawman directly, I understand the logic of your plan, but I have concerns. Primarily, I worry about endangering others in town should violence erupt. Additionally, I'm not convinced Blackwood would risk attacking a location where law enforcement is concentrated. The marshal looked impressed by her reasoned approach. Valid points, Miss Fletcher. What would you suggest instead? Abigail glanced at Samuel, a silent apology in her eyes before she spoke. I believe the original plan has merit, but with modifications. Rather than relocating to town, I could remain here where Blackwood already knows to find me. The difference would be preparation and reinforcement. You want to use my ranch as bait, Samuel stated, understanding dawning with cold clarity. I want to end this threat permanently, Abigail corrected, her voice strengthening with conviction. If Blackwood is captured here, the danger to Riversbend as a whole is eliminated. If I flee to another location, he simply follows, endangering more innocent people along the way. The logic was sound, much as Samuel hated to admit it. Furthermore, he recognized the courage it took for Abigail to suggest such a plan, to face her fears directly rather than continuing to run from them. It could work, Marshal Grant said thoughtfully. We could position men around the property, create the appearance of vulnerability while actually establishing a defensive perimeter. And what about Emma? Samuel asked, the safety of his daughter his paramount concern. I won't have her anywhere near this confrontation. Of course not, Abigail agreed immediately. She should stay with Mrs. Harris and Lily, well away from any potential danger. The discussion continued for another hour, details debated and contingencies considered. By the time the lawmen prepared to leave, a plan had been established. Emma would be taken to the Harris ranch the following morning. Marshal Grant would position his deputies and trusted local volunteers around the Morgan property that night. The next day, Samuel and Joe would make a visible trip to town, leaving Abigail apparently alone with only Thomas for protection. A scenario designed to tempt Blackwood into action. As Samuel walked the lawmen to their horses, Marshal Grant held back a moment after the others had mounted. Morgan, he said quietly, I should warn you, there's more to this situation than Miss Fletcher may have shared. Samuel stiffened. Meaning Harrington's interest in her goes beyond wounded pride or financial concerns. The marshal's expression was grim in the moonlight. Our informant says the banker has become obsessed with her. This isn't just business for him or for Blackwood. All the more reason to end it decisively, Samuel replied, though the information sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the night air. Marshal Grant studied him for a moment longer. You care for her, he observed. It wasn't a question. Samuel didn't bother denying what must have been obvious to everyone present during the tense discussion. She's under my protection, he said simply. That's all that matters right now. The marshal nodded slowly. Just be careful, Morgan. Feelings have a way of complicating tactical situations. With that final warning, he mounted his horse and followed the others down the drive, leaving Samuel alone with his thoughts. When he returned inside, Samuel found Abigail still sitting by the fire, her expression distant as she stared into the flames. Without speaking, he poured 2 glasses of whiskey from the bottle he kept for medicinal purposes, offering one to her as he took a seat in the chair opposite. I'm sorry, she said, accepting the glass with a grateful nod. I've brought danger to your home, to Emma. If I had known Harrington would go to such extremes. Don't, Samuel interrupted. You couldn't have anticipated this level of obsession. Few would. Abigail took a small sip of the whiskey, wincing slightly at the burn. The marshal told you more, didn't he, outside? Samuel nodded, seeing no point in concealing the truth. He believes Harrington's interest in you has become unhealthy, beyond what even money or pride would explain. A shudder passed through her, visible despite her efforts to control it. I suspected as much toward the end. The way he looked at me, spoke about me as though I were already his possession. She took another sip, larger this time. It was why I left so precipitously, without proper preparations. Something in his manner frightened me more than poverty ever could. You made the right choice, Samuel assured her, resisting the urge to move to the sofa beside her, to offer physical comfort that might be unwelcome or misinterpreted. And tomorrow we'll end this threat permanently. Abigail looked up, her eyes reflecting both the firelight and her own inner strength. I won't run again, Samuel. Whatever happens tomorrow, I intend to stand my ground, here in Riversbend, in the life I'm building for myself. The quiet determination in her voice stirred something profound in Samuel's chest. Admiration, certainly, but also a more complex emotion he wasn't ready to name. This woman, who had faced social disgrace, financial ruin, and now physical danger with unflinching courage, represented everything he respected in the human spirit. Then we stand together, he said simply, raising his glass in a small toast. Abigail's smile in response held warmth that defied the danger looming over them both. Together, she echoed, touching her glass to his. As the fire burned low and the ranch settled into uneasy silence, Samuel Morgan found himself facing a truth he could no longer deny. Somewhere between the blizzard's enforced intimacy and tonight's shared crisis, Abigail Fletcher had breached the walls around his heart. Whatever tomorrow brought, victory or defeat, safety or peril, nothing between them would ever be the same again. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, as he finally bid her good night and watched her climb the stairs to her room, Samuel felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The quiet certainty that some risks were worth taking, even on the unforgiving frontier where second chances came rarely and at high cost. Dawn broke clear and cold over the Morgan ranch, the rising sun casting long shadows across the snow-covered yard. Samuel had barely slept, dividing his time between checking on Emma, conferring with Joe and Thomas about the plan, and monitoring the perimeter of his property for any sign of intruders. Marshal Grant and his men had positioned themselves strategically around the ranch during the night, 2 in the barn, 1 in the bunkhouse with Thomas, others concealed in the tree line that bordered the eastern edge of the property. Sheriff Adams remained in town to coordinate additional support if needed, while maintaining the appearance of normal activity to avoid alerting any of Blackwood's scouts who might be watching. Samuel found Abigail in the kitchen shortly after sunrise, already dressed and preparing breakfast as though it were any ordinary day. The simple domesticity of the scene, her hair neatly braided, her sleeves rolled up as she worked at the stove, contrasted sharply with the danger they both knew was approaching. "You should have slept longer," he said, pouring himself coffee from the pot she'd prepared. "It might be a long day." Abigail offered a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I doubt I could have slept any later even if I'd tried." "Better to keep busy." She nodded toward the platter of biscuits cooling on the table. "I thought a substantial breakfast might be wise for everyone involved in today's activities." The deliberate understatement made Samuel's lips twitch despite the tension. Marshall's men will appreciate it. Nothing worse than facing outlaws on an empty stomach. Their attempt at normalcy was interrupted by Emma's appearance in the doorway, still in her nightgown, her dark hair tousled from sleep. "Daddy, why are there men in the barn? I saw them from my window." Samuel and Abigail exchanged a quick glance. They had planned to explain Emma's visit to the Harris Ranch as a simple playdate with Lily, sparing her the fear of knowing the real reason for her removal from the ranch. "Just some extra hands helping with a project," Samuel improvised, lifting his daughter into his arms. "And speaking of projects, how would you like to spend the day with Lily, Mrs. Harris mentioned yesterday that she'd welcome your company while she teaches Lily to make apple dumplings." Emma's face lit up at the prospect, exactly as Samuel had hoped. "Can I really?" "Lily said her grandmother makes the best dumplings in the territory." "Indeed you can," Abigail confirmed, smoothing the child's wild hair with a gentle hand. "In fact, I've packed a small bag for you already with everything you'll need for an overnight visit." "Won't that be exciting?" The easy way Abigail redirected Emma's curiosity impressed Samuel, as did the natural affection evident in her interaction with his daughter. In just 2 weeks, Abigail had become an integral part of their household, someone Emma looked to for guidance and comfort almost as readily as she did her father. Breakfast passed with forced cheerfulness, Emma's excitement about her visit providing a welcome distraction from the tension vibrating between the adults. Marshal Grant and 2 of his men joined them briefly, their presence explained to Emma as friends helping Daddy with ranch business. By mid-morning, all was in readiness. Samuel prepared the wagon while Abigail helped Emma dress warmly for the journey to the Harris Ranch. The plan was straightforward. Samuel would deliver Emma to safety, then proceed to town with Joe, making their presence known at the general store and saloon to establish the impression that the ranch was minimally defended. "Remember," Marshal Grant instructed as Samuel prepared to depart, "make it obvious you're leaving Joe in town to purchase supplies. We want Blackwood to believe Miss Fletcher is here with only Thomas for protection." Samuel nodded grimly, his jaw tight with tension. He hated every aspect of this plan despite recognizing its tactical soundness. Using Abigail as bait, even with substantial protection in place, felt fundamentally wrong, a violation of his deepest instincts to protect rather than expose to danger. "Marshal," he said quietly, drawing the lawman aside, "if anything happens to her." "It won't," Grant interrupted with confidence born of experience. "We have the advantage of preparation and superior numbers. Blackwood is arrogant enough to believe he can take a single woman from a barely defended ranch without difficulty. That arrogance will be his downfall." The assurance did little to ease Samuel's concern, but time was running short. With a final nod to the marshal, he turned to where Abigail stood on the porch with Emma, their heads bent close together as they shared some private conversation. "Ready to go, little one?" He called, forcing lightness into his tone. Emma broke away from Abigail, racing down the steps with childish enthusiasm. Ready, Miss Abigail gave me a book to show Lily, one with pictures of faraway places. Samuel lifted her into the wagon before turning back to Abigail, who remained on the porch, her expression carefully composed despite the fear he knew she must be feeling. "I'll return by sundown," he said, the words carrying more meaning than Emma could understand. "Stay close to the house, as we discussed." Abigail nodded, her hands clasped tightly before her. "We'll be waiting," she replied, the simple phrase an acknowledgement of all that remained unspoken between them. With a final look that he hoped conveyed everything he couldn't say aloud, Samuel climbed into the wagon beside his daughter and set the horses in motion, acutely aware that he was leaving behind a woman who had come to mean far more to him than he had ever intended to allow. The journey to the Harris ranch passed in a blur of Emma's chatter and Samuel's divided attention. He scanned the countryside constantly for any sign of unfamiliar riders, one hand always near the rifle positioned beside him on the wagon seat. No danger materialized, however, and Mrs. Harris welcomed Emma with genuine warmth, Lily already waiting excitedly at the door for her friend's arrival. "We'll take good care of her, Mrs. Harris assured Samuel privately as they watched the girls race inside. "My son and his hands are all aware of the situation. No one will get near the children." Samuel nodded gratefully. Jacob Harris was a solid man, his ranch well defended and located in the opposite direction from town relative to the Morgan property, as far from potential danger as Emma could reasonably be placed. "I'll return tomorrow," Samuel said, "or send word if circumstances delay me. Either way, keep Emma here until you hear directly from me or Sheriff Adams." With his daughter safely delivered, Samuel proceeded to town as planned, meeting Joe at the prearranged location outside Riversbend. Together, they made a conspicuous appearance at Patterson's General Store, the Silver Dollar Saloon, and the Livery Stable, ensuring that anyone watching would note their extended absence from the ranch. "You reckon Blackwood's really got men observing the town?" Joe asked as they loaded supplies into the wagon in full view of the main street. The young ranch hand's expression was calm, but Samuel didn't miss the nervous adjustment of the pistol at his hip. "Marshall seems to think so," Samuel replied, deliberately speaking loudly enough to be overheard by anyone nearby. "That's why we need to finish up here and head back. Don't like leaving Thomas alone at the ranch with Miss Fletcher for too long." The staged conversation complete, they spent another hour in town. Enough time to make their absence from the ranch significant, but not so long that their return would prevent Blackwood from acting if he was indeed watching and waiting for an opportunity. As they finally turned the wagon toward home in the late afternoon, Samuel felt tension coiling tighter in his chest with each mile that brought them closer to the ranch. And to Abigail, waiting as the central figure in a dangerous gambit that relied on too many variables for his comfort. "We'll approach from the south pasture," he instructed Joe as they neared the ranch. "Leave the wagon in the trees and proceed on foot. Marshall's men should be expecting us from that direction." Joe nodded, his young face settling into lines of determination. Like many who grew up in frontier territories, the ranch hand had seen his share of violence despite his youth. "You really think they'll come for her, boss?" Samuel's grip tightened on the reins. "If Marshall Grant's information is accurate, yes. Blackwood's been paid too well to abandon his target now." They fell silent as the ranch came into view in the distance, everything appearing normal from this vantage point. Smoke rising from the chimney, a figure that must be Thomas moving between the house and barn, no obvious signs of disturbance or danger. Yet Samuel couldn't shake the foreboding that pressed upon him as they circled wide to approach from the south, leaving the wagon concealed as planned and continuing on foot through the trees that bordered his property. Something felt wrong, an instinct honed by years of frontier survival warning him of danger his conscious mind couldn't yet identify. They were met at the edge of the tree line by one of Marshal Grant's deputies, who guided them to the barn where the marshal himself waited with several men. "Any sign of Blackwood?" Samuel asked without preamble. Marshal Grant shook his head. "Nothing yet, but my gut says they'll move soon before sunset. They'll want enough daylight to make their escape with the woman, but late enough that pursuit would be hampered by nightfall." "Where's Miss Fletcher now?" "In the house with Thomas, as planned. She's maintaining the appearance of normal routine, hung laundry earlier, worked in the kitchen garden despite the cold, playing her part perfectly." The praise did nothing to ease Samuel's growing unease. "I want to see her," he stated rather than asked, already moving toward the barn door. Marshal Grant caught his arm. "Morgan, we discussed this. You're supposed to remain in town until the trap is sprung. If Blackwood sees you return early, he might delay or change his approach entirely." "Something's not right," Samuel insisted, pulling free of the marshal's grasp. "I can feel it." Before the argument could escalate, a sharp whistle from outside drew everyone's attention. One of the deputies positioned near the house slipped into the barn, his expression urgent. "Riders approaching from the east," he reported. 5 men, moving fast but staying close to the tree line for cover. Marshal Grant's demeanor shifted instantly from cautionary to commanding. "Positions, everyone. Remember, we want Blackwood alive if possible, but don't hesitate to shoot if lives are at risk." As the men dispersed to their assigned locations, Samuel gripped the marshal's shoulder. "I'm going to the house, now." This time Grant didn't argue. "Stay low and move fast. And Morgan," he paused, his weathered face grave, "remember that Blackwood wants the woman alive. He won't kill her, but he'll have no such restraint with you." With a curt nod, Samuel slipped out of the barn, using outbuildings and fences for cover as he made his way toward the house. The approaching riders were not yet visible from his position, but he could hear the distant thunder of hooves growing steadily louder. He was halfway to the porch when the first shot rang out, followed immediately by a fusillade of gunfire from multiple directions. Samuel dropped instinctively, scanning the chaotic scene that erupted around him. Blackwood's men had split up, 2 heading for the barn where they'd apparently spotted some of the lawmen, while 3 others charged directly toward the house. Through the confusion of gunsmoke and shouting, Samuel caught a glimpse of a tall man in a black coat at the head of the group approaching the house. James Blackwood himself, based on descriptions he'd heard. The outlaw leader moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to violence, firing methodically at defenders while driving steadily toward his objective. Samuel raised his rifle, seeking a clear shot, but at that moment the front door of the house burst open. Thomas staggered onto the porch, blood spreading across his shirt from a wound in his shoulder, evidence that at least one of Blackwood's men had circled behind the house and entered from another direction. "Morgan," Thomas shouted, spotting his employer. "They're inside already." "Came through the back." Before he could finish, a shot from one of the approaching riders struck him in the chest, sending him crumpling to the porch floor. The sight of his loyal ranch hand falling unleashed something primal in Samuel, rage and fear crystallizing into cold, focused purpose. Using the chaos of the gunfight as cover, he sprinted toward the house, no longer concerned with concealment. 2 of Marshal Grant's men provided covering fire, forcing Blackwood and his companions to seek shelter temporarily behind the water trough near the front yard. Samuel reached the porch in seconds, pausing only long enough to confirm that Thomas was beyond help before charging through the front door, rifle ready. The interior of his home had become a battleground, furniture overturned, a lamp shattered on the floor, blood spattered across the polished wooden boards. "Abigail," he shouted, moving deeper into the house, every sense heightened by adrenaline and fear. A crash from upstairs drew his attention. Taking the steps 2 at a time, Samuel reached the landing just as a struggle spilled out of Abigail's room into the hallway. She was fighting fiercely against a bearded man who had one arm locked around her waist, the other holding a pistol he was trying to control despite her resistance. "Let her go," Samuel commanded, raising his rifle to aim directly at the man's head. The outlaw froze, momentarily caught between his captive and the new threat. In that instant of hesitation, Abigail drove her elbow sharply backward into his ribs, simultaneously stamping hard on his instep. The unexpected attack loosened his grip just enough for her to twist away, dropping to the floor and rolling toward the wall, leaving Samuel with a clear shot. He didn't hesitate. The rifle's report was deafening in the confined space of the hallway, and the outlaw crumpled without a sound, dead before he hit the floor. "Are you hurt?" Samuel demanded, moving quickly to help Abigail to her feet. She shook her head, breathless but remarkably composed given the circumstances. "No, but Thomas." "I know," Samuel cut her off, unable to address that loss in the midst of ongoing danger. "We need to move. Blackwood himself is outside with at least 2 others." As if summoned by his name, a new voice called from the bottom of the stairs, deep, confident, chilling in its calm authority. "Miss Fletcher," the voice announced, This situation has become unnecessarily violent. I suggest you come downstairs willingly before more people die on your behalf." Samuel pulled Abigail behind him, positioning them both at the angle of the hallway where they couldn't be seen from below. "Blackwood," he murmured, confirming what she had already guessed. Abigail's fingers dug into his arm, but when she spoke, her voice was remarkably steady. "What do we do?" Before Samuel could answer, Blackwood spoke again. "I know you're up there with her, Morgan. My employer would prefer her unharmed, but he's realistic about the circumstances. Dead or alive, Miss Fletcher is returning to Boston. The only variable is how many more people die today." The cold calculation in the outlaw's voice made Samuel's decision clear. "Stay behind me," he whispered to Abigail. "When I engage him, run for the back stairs and out through the kitchen. Marshall's men should have secured that area by now." Abigail's grip on his arm tightened. "I won't leave you to face him alone," she hissed. "This isn't a debate," Samuel replied, his tone brooking no argument. "Emma needs at least one of us to survive this day." The mention of his daughter struck home. Abigail's expression shifted from stubborn resistance to pained acceptance. With a small nod, she released his arm and positioned herself to move toward the back staircase at his signal. "Your time is running out, Blackwood," Samuel called down the stairs, deliberately drawing attention to himself. "Marshal Grant has your men surrounded. Surrender now and you might avoid the gallows." A dark chuckle drifted up from below. "Marshal Grant is currently occupied with what remains of my associates, and my client pays exceptionally well for success. Now, I'll give you to the count of 3 to send Miss Fletcher down, or I start shooting up the entire second floor." Samuel used the outlaw's speech to gauge his position, just at the bottom of the main staircase, likely using the solid newel post as cover. A direct confrontation would be dangerous, but so would waiting for Blackwood to make good on his threat. "1, Blackwood began the count, his tone almost bored. "Go now," Samuel whispered urgently to Abigail. "Whatever happens, don't stop." 2. As Blackwood's voice rang out again, Samuel moved with the decisive action of a man who had spent his life making split-second judgments in dangerous situations. He spun around the corner of the hallway, dropping to one knee to present a smaller target as he fired rapidly down the staircase. Simultaneously, Abigail ran for the back stairs, her skirts gathered in one hand to prevent tripping, moving exactly as instructed despite what must have been overwhelming fear. Blackwood returned fire immediately, bullets splintering the wood of the banister inches from Samuel's position. The exchange was brief but intense, both men emptying their weapons in seconds. In the momentary lull as both reloaded, Samuel heard the welcome sound of Abigail's footsteps receding down the back stairs. She had at least made it that far. "Persistent, aren't you?" Blackwood called up, his voice still maddeningly controlled despite the violent exchange. Most men would have surrendered the woman by now, especially one not even their wife. "Maybe I just object to kidnapping on principle," Samuel replied, buying time as he reloaded his rifle with practiced efficiency. A sound from below suggested Blackwood was moving, likely trying to find a better angle for his next attack. Samuel shifted his own position in response, maintaining the defensive advantage of higher ground while straining to hear any indication of Abigail's success in reaching safety outside. "It's hardly kidnapping when I'm returning her to her rightful place," Blackwood countered, his voice now coming from a different location. He had moved to the main room below, perhaps seeking access to the back stairs himself. The realization galvanized Samuel into action. If Blackwood reached the kitchen before Abigail made it outside, she would be trapped. Abandoning caution, Samuel descended the main staircase in a controlled rush, rifle ready, scanning for his opponent among the shadowed corners of his violated home. Movement near the kitchen doorway caught his eye, Blackwood, moving with predatory grace toward the back of the house. Samuel fired without hesitation, the shot going wide as the outlaw ducked at the last moment, disappearing into the kitchen. Cursing under his breath, Samuel followed, every sense alert for the trap he knew might be waiting. The kitchen appeared empty at first glance, the back door standing open, evidence of Abigail's passage or Blackwood's trick, he couldn't tell which. The answer came in the form of a pistol shot from behind the large cabinet next to the doorway. The bullet grazed Samuel's arm, tearing through his sleeve and drawing a line of fire across his bicep. He returned fire instinctively, diving behind the sturdy kitchen table for cover as Blackwood emerged fully from his hiding place. "You're bleeding, Morgan," the outlaw observed casually, as though commenting on the weather. "How much more are you willing to lose for a woman who's not yours to protect?" In the diffuse light filtering through the kitchen windows, Samuel got his first clear look at James Blackwood. The outlaw was perhaps 40, with aristocratic features that seemed at odds with his violent profession. He moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to winning, his eyes cold and calculating as he assessed his opponent. "She doesn't belong to anyone," Samuel stated flatly, tracking Blackwood's movements while looking for an opening. "Certainly not to some coward in Boston, too, afraid to face rejection himself." A flicker of amusement crossed Blackwood's face. "Harrington's peculiarities are of no interest to me beyond the price he's willing to pay. Business is business, after all." He gestured with his pistol toward the open door. "Your Miss Fletcher has made it outside, I believe. Shall we join her? I'm curious to see if Marshal Grant's men are as effective as you seem to think." The invitation was obviously a ploy, but Samuel had little choice but to engage. Every moment he kept Blackwood occupied was another moment for Abigail to reach safety and for the marshal's forces to secure the perimeter. "After you," Samuel replied with mock courtesy, keeping his rifle trained steadily on the outlaw. Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I insist." Whatever he intended to say next was interrupted by a thunderous crash as something, or someone, collided with the back door, slamming it against the wall with violent force. Both men turned toward the sound, weapons shifting to cover the new threat. Abigail stood in the doorway, a shotgun braced against her shoulder, Thomas's weapon, Samuel realized with a jolt of surprise. Behind her, two of Marshal Grant's deputies were visible, both with rifles aimed past her at Blackwood. "Drop your weapon," Abigail commanded, her voice remarkably steady despite the slight tremor visible in her hands as she held the unfamiliar firearm. "It's over, Mr. Blackwood." For a fraction of a second, the outlaw seemed genuinely caught off guard by her reappearance, perhaps expecting her to flee rather than return with reinforcements. The momentary surprise quickly gave way to cold assessment as he evaluated his diminishing options. "It seems we have a standoff," Blackwood observed, his pistol still aimed at Samuel while his eyes flicked between the new threats at the door. "3 guns against one isn't favorable odds, I admit, but at this range, I wouldn't miss Mr. Morgan, are you willing to risk that, Miss Fletcher?" The calculation was clear. Blackwood might die, but he could ensure Samuel died first if anyone fired. What happened next occurred with such speed that Samuel would later struggle to reconstruct the precise sequence. Abigail's expression shifted subtly, determination replacing fear. As though responding to some invisible signal, the deputies behind her dropped to firing positions on either side of the doorway. And Blackwood, perhaps sensing the change in atmosphere, began to pivot toward this greater threat. Samuel lunged forward in the same instant, driven by instinct rather than conscious thought. His shoulder connected with Blackwood's midsection just as the outlaw's pistol discharged, the bullet embedding itself in the ceiling rather than any human target. The impact drove both men to the floor, Samuel's greater weight momentarily pinning his opponent. The advantage was brief. Blackwood was a seasoned fighter, and he responded with practiced violence, driving a knee into Samuel's wounded arm and using the burst of pain to throw him off. As they grappled on the kitchen floor, Samuel was dimly aware of Abigail and the deputies holding their fire, unable to shoot without risking hitting him instead of Blackwood. "Enough," Blackwood snarled, managing to bring his pistol up again despite the struggle. At point-blank range, even a hasty shot would be fatal. What saved Samuel's life in that critical moment was not his own strength or skill, but the sound of Emma's voice that suddenly filled his mind. "Daddy, why don't you ever smile like in the picture with Mama?" reminding him of everything he stood to lose, of the daughter who needed him to survive this day. With a surge of desperate strength, Samuel knocked Blackwood's arm aside just as the pistol fired again, the bullet grazing his cheek instead of finding its intended target between his eyes. The pain was secondary to the opportunity created by the outlaw's momentarily extended position. Samuel drove his fist into Blackwood's throat with every ounce of force he could muster, crushing the man's windpipe with a single, decisive blow. The effect was immediate and gruesome. The outlaw's eyes widened in shock, his body convulsing as he fought for breath that wouldn't come. Within moments, Marshal Grant himself burst through the front door with additional men, securing the scene even as Blackwood's struggles weakened and finally ceased altogether. The outlaw leader died on the kitchen floor of the Morgan Ranch, his final expression one of disbelief that his long career of violence had ended in such an ignoble fashion. Samuel, Abigail's voice cut through the confusion as she dropped the shotgun and rushed to his side, heedless of the blood and danger. "You're hurt, your face, your arm." "Scratches," he managed, though the adrenaline was beginning to fade, bringing sharper awareness of his injuries. "Are you all right? Did he hurt you before I reached you upstairs?" Her hands were gentle on his face as she examined the bullet graze along his cheekbone. "I'm unharmed. Thomas saw them coming through the trees and warned me just in time to get upstairs." Her voice caught. "He tried to hold them off." "I know," Samuel said quietly, the loss of his loyal ranch hand a pain that would register more fully later, when the immediate crisis had passed. "You were brave to come back with the deputies." "I couldn't leave you to face him alone," Abigail replied with simple honesty. "Not after everything you've risked for me." Their eyes met in a moment of perfect understanding, a recognition of something profound that had developed between them despite the unlikely circumstances of their meeting and the dangers they had faced together. The moment was interrupted by Marshal Grant's approach, his expression grim but satisfied as he surveyed the scene. "It's over," he announced. "Two of Blackwood's men dead, one wounded and captured. My deputy Wilson took a bullet in the leg, but he'll recover." "And Thomas?" Samuel asked, already knowing the answer but needing confirmation. The marshal shook his head. "I'm sorry, Morgan. He was gone before we could do anything for him." The news, though expected, hit hard. Thomas had been with the ranch for 5 years, a quiet, reliable man who had become part of the extended family that comprised the Morgan household. His loss would be felt keenly by everyone, especially Joe, who had looked to the older man as a mentor. "I'll see that his family in Denver is notified," Samuel said, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders despite his physical injuries. "And compensated appropriately." Marshal Grant nodded his understanding. "You need medical attention first. Dr. Peterson is on his way from town. Sheriff Adams sent for him as soon as we heard the first shots." The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Samuel's wounds were cleaned and bandaged by the doctor, deemed painful but not life-threatening. The bodies of Blackwood and his men were removed for transport to town, while Thomas was prepared for a proper burial on the ranch, as befitted a man who had given his life in service to the land and its people. Throughout it all, Abigail remained a steadfast presence, organizing food for the lawmen, assisting the doctor, ensuring the house was restored to some semblance of order despite the violence that had violated its peace. Her practical efficiency impressed even Marshal Grant, who commented quietly to Samuel that she had the makings of a true frontier woman, despite her Eastern origins. By nightfall, most of the outsiders had departed, leaving only a deputy stationed at the ranch as a precaution, while Marshal Grant and Sheriff Adams returned to town with their prisoner. Samuel sat before the fire in the main room, physically and emotionally exhausted, but unable to rest until one final matter was resolved. "I've sent word to Mrs. Harris that it's safe to bring Emma home tomorrow," Abigail said, joining him with 2 cups of coffee. "I hope that meets with your approval." Samuel accepted the cup gratefully. "Yes, though I'll need to prepare her for the news about Thomas. She was fond of him." "Children are remarkably resilient," Abigail observed, taking the chair opposite his. "Emma more than most, I think. She has her father's strength." The compliment warmed something in Samuel's chest that had nothing to do with coffee or fireplace. "She has her mother's heart," he countered. "Catherine would have liked you, I think." The simple statement clearly touched Abigail deeply. "That means a great deal coming from you," she said softly. Silence fell between them, comfortable despite the traumatic events of the day. Outside, the stars emerged one by one, the same stars that had witnessed their conversation on the porch just 24 hours earlier, a lifetime ago, it seemed. "What happens now?" Samuel finally asked, the question encompassing far more than just the immediate aftermath of Blackwood's attack. Abigail met his gaze directly, understanding the layers of his inquiry. "Harrington will learn that his hired gun failed. Whether that ends his pursuit remains to be seen, but Marshal Grant believes the death of Blackwood will send a powerful message about the consequences of such actions. And you? What do you want to happen now? The directness of his question brought a flush to her cheeks, visible even in the firelight. I came to Riversbend seeking safety and purpose, she said carefully. I've found both along with connections I hadn't dared hope for. She paused, seeming to gather courage before continuing. I still intend to teach, to fulfill the commitment I made to this community. Beyond that, her eyes, twilight blue and unwavering, held his. Beyond that depends partly on you, Samuel Morgan. The honesty of her response demanded equal candor from him. Setting aside his coffee, Samuel leaned forward, close enough that he could have taken her hands in his had he dared. When Catherine died, I believed that part of my life was over, he said, his voice low and rough with emotion. I convinced myself that the frontier was no place for second chances, that survival and raising Emma were all I could expect from whatever years remained to me. Abigail remained silent, allowing him to find his way through thoughts he had barely acknowledged to himself until this moment. Then you arrived during that blizzard and something shifted, not immediately, not dramatically, but undeniably. He searched for words to express the transformation that had occurred so gradually yet profoundly. It was as though you brought spring after a winter I had resigned myself to enduring indefinitely. The metaphor seemed to touch something in Abigail, her eyes brightening with unshed tears. I never expected to find a home here, she admitted. I was running from something, not toward anything specific, but from that first night when you and Emma welcomed me despite the imposition. I began a hope for more than mere escape. The confession hung between them, fragile and precious. Samuel was acutely aware that they stood at a threshold, that his next words would either open a door to possibilities he had denied himself for years, or close it perhaps permanently. I can't promise it will be easy, he said finally. The ranch demands everything I have some days. Emma needs more than I can often give her alone, and he hesitated, then continued with raw honesty. I'm out of practice at allowing myself to care this deeply for anyone beyond my daughter. I'm not asking for promises of perfection, Abigail replied, her voice steady despite the emotion visible in her expression. Only for permission to stay, not just as Emma's teacher or your house guest, but as someone who might, in time, become something more to you both. The simplicity of her request, so reasonable and yet so profound in its implications, broke through the last of Samuel's carefully constructed defenses. Without conscious decision, he found himself rising from his chair, moving to kneel beside hers, taking her hands in his as he should have done months ago had fear not held him captive. Abigail Fletcher, he said, her name feeling right in a way few things had since Catherine's death. I would be honored if you would stay, in whatever capacity feels right to you, for as long as you wish. The smile that illuminated her face then was like sunrise after the darkest night, radiant with hope and possibility. Then I accept, she said softly, her fingers tightening around his. Not out of fear or necessity, but because I choose this place, this life, and you, Samuel Morgan, with all the complications and uncertainties that entails. What passed between them in that moment transcended the traditional declarations of affection. It was an acknowledgement of shared survival, of found family, of possibilities neither had believed would come their way again. When Samuel finally rose and pulled her gently to her feet, their embrace felt both inevitable and miraculous, two people who had faced death together now choosing life, with all its messiness and promise. We should rest, he murmured against her hair, aware of his own exhaustion and her likely similar state. Tomorrow brings Emma home and all the explanations that entails. Abigail nodded against his shoulder, reluctant to end their closeness but practical as always. She'll have questions about Thomas, about the damage to the house. About us, Samuel added quietly. The addition made Abigail draw back slightly, searching his face with sudden uncertainty. Will that be difficult for her? To understand that I might. Emma adores you, Samuel assured her, tucking a strand of golden hair behind her ear with tender familiarity. And she's been asking for months why I don't smile like I did in photographs with her mother. I think she'll understand better than either of us expect. Relief softened Abigail's features, followed by a yawn she couldn't quite suppress. The events of the day had clearly taken their toll, despite her remarkable composure throughout. Go upstairs, Samuel urged gently. I'll check the doors and bank the fire. With a nod of agreement too weary for further discussion, Abigail squeezed his hand once more before turning toward the stairs. Samuel watched her go, marveling at the turns of fate that had brought this extraordinary woman into his life at precisely the moment when he had resigned himself to solitude. True to his word, he secured the house for the night, his movements automatic despite the fatigue weighing his limbs. As he prepared to climb the stairs himself, Samuel paused at the small table by the front door where a framed photograph of Catherine had stood since her death, a silent sentinel welcoming visitors to their home. I think you would approve, he said softly to the image of his first love. She has your courage, your determination to make beauty even in difficult places. The photograph offered no response, of course, but as Samuel made his way upstairs to his empty bedroom, empty for now, though perhaps not forever, he felt an inexplicable sense of peace, as though the past and future had reconciled themselves in a way that honored both without requiring him to choose between them. Outside, the Montana night wrapped itself around the Morgan ranch, the stars bearing witness to endings and beginnings alike, a cycle as old as the frontier itself, where loss and renewal walked hand in hand across the vast, uncompromising landscape of human hearts. The following morning brought Emma home, her initial excitement at returning quickly tempered by the news of Thomas's death and the visible evidence of violence still present despite efforts to erase it. Samuel explained as gently as possible what had happened, emphasizing that the danger was past while acknowledging the loss they had suffered. To his surprise, Emma's primary concern, once she had processed the basic facts, was for Abigail's welfare. Were the bad men trying to hurt Miss Abigail? She asked, her small face solemn as she sat between them on the sofa. They wanted to take her away, Samuel answered carefully. But they failed and they can't hurt anyone anymore. Emma considered this with the particular intensity children bring to matters of justice, because you protected her. Your father was very brave, Abigail confirmed, exchanging a look with Samuel over the child's head. He fought to keep everyone safe, especially me. This appeared to satisfy Emma, who nodded as though confirming something she had already suspected. That's what Daddy does, she stated with simple confidence. He protects people he loves. The innocent observation hung in the air, neither adult immediately responding to its implication. Finally, Samuel cleared his throat. Emma, there's something else we need to discuss with you. His serious tone caught his daughter's attention. She looked up at him expectantly, dark eyes so like Catherine's studying his expression for clues. Miss Abigail and I have been talking, Samuel began, uncertain how to explain the subtle but significant shift in their relationship to a 5-year-old. We've decided that she'll continue staying here with us, even after the schoolhouse is ready. Emma's brow furrowed in confusion. But you said she was only staying until the school was fixed. That was the original plan, Abigail agreed, her tone gentle. But sometimes plans change when people discover they enjoy being together more than they expected to. Understanding dawned gradually on Emma's face. Like when Lily was only supposed to visit for 1 day, but ended up staying 3 because we were having so much fun. Samuel couldn't help smiling at the comparison. Something like that, yes. Except Miss Abigail might stay for much longer than 3 days, perhaps permanently. Emma's eyes widened. Forever, she looked between the two adults, processing this new information with visible concentration. Like a new mama. The directness of the question momentarily robbed Samuel of speech. He had expected curiosity, perhaps even resistance, but not this immediate leap to the ultimate conclusion of the path he and Abigail had only just begun to explore together. Abigail recovered first, her voice steady despite the emotion visible in her eyes. That's not something anyone can promise right away, Emma. Your father and I care for each other very much, and we both care for you. But relationships between adults develop slowly, with time and consideration. But you might be my new mama someday, Emma persisted, apparently unsatisfied with such a measured response. Samuel found his voice at last. Emma, Miss Abigail isn't trying to replace your mother. No one could ever do that. But yes, in time, if we all continue to care for each other as we do now, she might become part of our family in a more official way. Emma absorbed this solemnly before breaking into a sudden, dazzling smile. I'd like that, she declared with the certainty only children can muster. You smile more when Miss Abigail is here, Daddy, and she makes better biscuits than you do. The simple, pragmatic approval startled a laugh from both adults, dissolving the tension that had built during the serious conversation. Emma, evidently satisfied that she had made her position clear, slid off the sofa. "Can I go see Buttercup now?" she asked, referring to her pony. "I promised I'd visit her as soon as I got home." "Joe will go with you," Samuel insisted, unwilling to let his daughter wander the ranch alone so soon after yesterday's violence, despite his confidence that the threat had passed. As Emma skipped out to find the young ranch hand, Samuel and Abigail were left alone, both somewhat dazed by the child's straightforward acceptance of their tentative new arrangement. "Well," Abigail said after a moment, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth, "at least we know where Emma stands on the matter." Samuel shook his head in wonder. Leave it to a 5-year-old to cut straight to the heart of things. "She's remarkably perceptive," Abigail observed, moving slightly closer on the sofa now that they were alone. "Though perhaps we weren't as subtle as we thought." "Apparently not," Samuel took her hand, still marveling at how natural the gesture felt despite its newness. "Are you truly prepared for this? Life on a ranch is demanding even in peaceful times, and you've already seen how dangerous it can be." Abigail's fingers tightened around his. "I made my choice yesterday, Samuel. Nothing that's happened since has changed my mind." She paused, then added with characteristic honesty, "I won't pretend I'm not nervous about certain aspects. I've never been a mother figure before, and my knowledge of ranching is theoretical at best." "You're already wonderful with Emma," Samuel assured her. "And as for ranching, Catherine knew nothing about cattle when she arrived. She learned, and so will you, if you want to." "I do want to," Abigail confirmed, her expression earnest. "All of it, the challenges, the work, the responsibility, because it comes with things I value more. Purpose, community, family." She met his gaze directly. "You." The simple declaration warmed Samuel to his core. Before he could respond, however, the sound of hooves in the yard announced visitors. Rising quickly, both moved to the window, instinctive caution not yet erased by yesterday's victory. "It's Sheriff Adams," Samuel identified the approaching rider with relief. "Probably bringing news about Blackwood's captured man." The sheriff's visit was brief but informative. The surviving outlaw had confirmed what they already suspected. Victor Harrington had indeed hired Blackwood specifically to retrieve Abigail, with instructions to bring her back to Boston by any means necessary. The gang's other activities in the territory had been a cover for their primary mission, though Blackwood had been happy to profit from both ventures simultaneously. "Marshall's sending telegrams east," Sheriff Adams explained as he prepared to depart. "This Harrington fellow will face serious questions about his involvement in multiple deaths, including Thomas's. Might not be able to make charges stick all the way from Montana, but his reputation in Boston will be ruined at minimum." The news provided a measure of closure, though Abigail's expression remained troubled after the sheriff rode away. "I never imagined my flight would result in such violence," she said quietly as they stood on the porch, watching dust settle on the road. "Thomas, the marshal's injured deputy, all because one man couldn't accept rejection." "You bear no responsibility for Harrington's obsession or Blackwood's choices," Samuel stated firmly, his arm slipping naturally around her shoulders. "The only person you're answerable to is yourself, and you chose courage and independence over submission to a man who viewed you as property. There's no shame in that." The conviction in his voice seemed to reach her, easing some of the guilt that had shadowed her expression. "Thank you," she said simply, leaning slightly against his side in a gesture of trust that moved him more than elaborate declarations might have done. They stood together for several moments, watching Emma in the distance as she happily showed Joe something about her pony, the child's resilience a reminder of life's persistence even in the wake of loss and violence. "We should finalize plans for the school opening," Abigail said eventually, practicality reasserting itself. "The cleaning day is scheduled for tomorrow, and classes should begin next week if possible." Samuel nodded, appreciating her determination to move forward despite recent upheavals. "And Thomas's funeral will be the day after tomorrow. I've sent word to the neighboring ranches. He was well respected throughout the valley." The mention of the funeral brought a fresh wave of sadness. but it was tempered by the shared understanding that life on the frontier demanded both acknowledgement of loss and commitment to continuing despite it. Death was not a stranger to these lands, but neither was the stubborn perseverance that allowed communities to thrive in the face of hardship. As they turned to go back inside, Samuel paused, struck by a sudden memory. Catherine always said that the true test of a home wasn't how it weathered good times, but how it stood against the storms. He looked at Abigail, finding comfort in her steady presence beside him. "This house has seen its share of both. And we'll see more of each, I imagine," Abigail replied with quiet certainty. "But it remains standing, as do we." Her hand found his, fingers intertwining with natural ease. "That's what matters in the end, isn't it, that we remain standing together?" The simple philosophy captured everything Samuel valued about this remarkable woman who had entered his life so unexpectedly. Her clear-eyed acceptance of reality combined with unwavering hope for the future. In that moment, watching her in the morning light with his daughter's laughter carrying across the yard, Samuel Morgan allowed himself to believe fully in second chances for the first time since Catherine's death. The frontier might be unforgiving in many ways, but it also offered possibilities unavailable in more settled places. The opportunity to reinvent oneself, to build something new from the ashes of what had been lost, to find love where it was least expected but perhaps most needed. As they crossed the threshold together, returning to the house that had witnessed both tragedy and triumph in recent days, Samuel silently renewed his commitment to the land, to his daughter, and now to this woman who had proven herself worthy of the Morgan Ranch and everything it represented, not through birth or wealth, but through courage, determination, and the kind of love that chose to stay even when running would have been easier. The future stretched before them, uncertain as always on the frontier, but promising in ways Samuel had forgotten were possible. Whatever challenges awaited, they would face them as they had faced Blackwood, together, with shared strength greater than the sum of its parts. And in that knowledge, Samuel found a peace he had thought forever beyond his reach in the aftermath of loss. Montana territory had taken much from him over the years, but it had also given in equal measure. Now, with Abigail by his side and Emma skipping back toward the house with renewed childhood resilience, the scales seemed finally, improbably balanced, past honored, present embraced, future welcomed with open arms and an open heart. 6 months later, the schoolhouse bustled with activity as students filed in for the morning session, their voices a cheerful cacophony that spilled through the open windows into the yard, where the snow had long since melted to reveal the vibrant green of early summer. Abigail stood at the front of the room, ringing the new brass bell that Samuel had installed in the tower just last week. A gift to the town, he'd said, though everyone knew it was really a gift for her. "Take your seats, please," she called out, her voice carrying easily over the din. "We have a short day today, remember." "Because of the wedding," a boy in the front row shouted, eliciting giggles from the girls and a grin from Abigail she couldn't quite suppress. "Because of the wedding," she agreed, her eyes seeking the window where she knew a certain wagon would soon appear. "So we must make the most of our morning." Life in Riverspend had settled into a rhythm that was both new and wonderfully familiar. The schoolhouse was thriving with 20 students now enrolled. The Blackwater gang was a fading memory, a dark chapter that had closed with the winter snows, and the Morgan Ranch, the ranch had become a home in every sense of the word. At noon, the wagon arrived right on schedule. Samuel pulled the team to a halt near the schoolyard gate, his Sunday suit brushed and pressed, though he looked slightly uncomfortable in the stiff collar. Beside him sat Emma, bouncing with excitement in a dress of pale pink calico that Abigail had sewn for her. Miss Abigail," Emma cried as the teacher dismissed her class. "It's time, Mrs. Patterson is waiting with the dress." Abigail gathered her books, her heart doing a frantic little dance in her chest. Today was the day. After 6 months of courtship, proper public courtship that involved Sunday dinners, long walks, and a chasteness that tested Samuel's patience daily, they were finally to be married. Samuel jumped down to help her into the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist. "Ready?" he asked, his hazel eyes warm with a heat that had nothing to do with the summer sun. "Nervous," she admitted, settling onto the bench beside him. "Don't be," he said, climbing up and taking the reins. "It's just the whole town watching, and the marshal, and my sister from Helena." Abigail laughed, the sound freeing the butterflies in her stomach. "You're not helping, Samuel." I'm not trying to help, he teased. I'm trying to get you to the church before you change your mind. Not a chance, she whispered, covering his hand with hers. The wedding preparation took place at Mrs. Patterson's house, which had been turned into a makeshift bridal suite. The dress had been a collaborative effort, silk ordered from St. Louis, lace from Abigail's own trunk, and hours of stitching by the women of Riverspend who had embraced the schoolteacher as one of their own. When Abigail finally stepped out of the dressing room, the chatter in the parlor ceased. Mrs. Patterson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Martha, Samuel's sister, smiled broadly, but it was Emma who stole the moment. The little girl stood frozen near the door, her eyes wide with wonder as she took in the vision of Abigail in cream silk and lace, her golden hair piled high and adorned with wildflowers. Oh, Emma breathed, her hands flying to her mouth. Samuel was waiting on the porch, banished from the house until the ceremony. Hearing the silence, he couldn't resist glancing through the open window. He saw Abigail at the same moment. Emma turned to run to him. "Daddy, Daddy, look." Emma scrambled onto the porch, grabbing his hand and pulling him toward the window, forgetting all about the superstition of the groom not seeing the bride. Samuel let himself be pulled, though he didn't need the encouragement. His gaze was already fixed on the woman standing in the center of the room, the woman who had walked out of a blizzard and into his life, thawing a heart he thought frozen forever. "She's beautiful, Daddy," Emma whispered loudly, her voice filled with awe. "She looks like a princess in my storybooks." Samuel swallowed past the lump in his throat. He looked at his daughter, whose world was now whole again, and then at his bride, whose eyes met his with a promise of forever. "Yes, Emma," he said, his voice rough with emotion. She's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Abigail blushed, her smile radiant. "Samuel Morgan, you're breaking the rules," she scolded gently through the screen. "I make the rules on my ranch," he countered, grinning. "And the rule is I don't spend one more minute waiting than I have to." The ceremony was held in the small white church, packed to the rafters with friends, neighbors, and students. The air was thick with the scent of summer roses and the dust of the frontier, a perfume that Abigail now associated entirely with happiness. As she walked down the aisle, escorted by Marshal Grant, who had returned specifically for the honor, Abigail looked at the faces around her. She saw Joe beaming in a new shirt, Mrs. Harris nodding approval, the children she taught wriggling in their Sunday best. And at the altar, flanked by his sister and a bouncing Emma, stood Samuel. He watched her approach with a look of such intense, focused devotion that the rest of the room faded away. When the minister asked for the rings, Emma stepped forward, holding the small velvet pillow with solemn importance. Samuel took the simple gold band, his hand steady as he reached for Abigail's. "With this ring," he said, his voice carrying to the back of the church, "I thee wed, with my body I thee worship, and with all my worldly goods I thee endow." Abigail's hand trembled slightly as she placed Samuel's ring on his finger. "In sickness and in health," she whispered, "through blizzards and sunshine until death parts us." When they kissed, a cheer erupted that shook the window panes. The reception was held at the ranch, tables spread across the yard under the shade of the cottonwoods. Fiddles played, food disappeared at an alarming rate, and laughter rang out until the stars began to appear in the twilight sky. As the festivities wound down, Samuel found Abigail standing by the fence line, looking out at the moonlit valley. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Regrets?" he asked quietly, the old question surfacing one last time. "Boston is a long way away." Abigail leaned back into him, feeling the solid strength of her husband, the anchor she had found in the storm. She looked at the house where Emma was already asleep, at the land that was now hers to love and tend. "I was lost in Boston, Samuel," she said softly. "I was just a shadow of who I was supposed to be. Here," she turned in his arms, placing her hands on his chest. "Here I am found, I am home." Samuel kissed her, a slow, deep kiss that sealed the promise of the future. "Welcome home, Mrs. Morgan," he murmured against her lips. "It's good to be here, Mr. Morgan," she replied. And as the music faded and the guests departed, leaving them alone under the vast, star-filled Montana sky, Samuel Morgan knew that his daughter had been right. His bride was beautiful. But the life they were about to build together, that was going to be nothing short of a masterpiece.